Russia is trying to spy on the UK, and the UK isn't going to let that happen. Worst of all, Russia has tried this trick twice. It sent its spy ship into British waters in late November of last year, then again in January 2025. Both times the UK tracked it and sent a message to the Russians. "We know you're here and we're not happy about it." So what actually happened? What vessels did the Royal Navy use to track the Russian spy ship? And just what is Putin trying to pull with this move in the first place? We answer those questions and more in this video. Let's start with the most recent encounter. On January 22nd, the Royal Navy, the UK's powerful naval force, announced that it had detected the presence of a Russian spy ship named Yantar sailing in British waters. In response, it sent both the HMS Somerset and the HMS Tyne to track the Russian vessel. These are surface vessels, with the HMS Somerset also having the ability to launch Merlin helicopters into the skies to covertly track targets. That's precisely what the ship did in January. Out of sight of the Yantar, the HMS Somerset's Merlin helicopter took flight, after which it scanned the waters around Britain using its powerful sensors to detect the presence of the Russian ship. The Yantar was soon located, sailing towards the English Channel, allowing both the HMS Somerset and HMS Tyne to move to its location. The HMS Somerset, which is a Type 23 frigate, caught up to the Yantar and intercepted it right at the entrance to the channel and just south of a traffic separation scheme located in Ushant, France. "The Royal Navy is always there when the nation needs, protecting our home and the waters that surround it," said the HMS Somerset's commanding officer Matthew Tier. "This is routine business for the HMS Somerset Ship Company and the Royal Navy, but it's nonetheless vital work for the UK security, and I'm proud of the professionalism of my crew." The reality is that Britain and its NATO partners knew what the Yantar was up to long before it came close to the channel. NATO ships have been tracking the Russian vessel's movement since it arrived in French waters, with the HMS Somerset combining with the HMS Tyne to take over those duties. Using its radars and sensors, the HMS Somerset reported on every move the Yantar made during the operation, sticking close to the ship as it made its way through the channel and beyond the Strait of Dover. It was the second time in January that the UK had to shadow a Russian vessel in its waters. But by now you're probably asking the question, where's the submarine in all of this? No British submarines were involved in the January Yantar monitoring, but this wasn't the first time Russia had to send its spy ship into British waters. Russia had already tried to do it before in November 2024, and that time the UK sent one of its subs. Speaking about the January 22nd incident, the UK's Defence Secretary John Healey revealed to Parliament that he had ordered a Royal Navy submarine to track the very same Russian ship in British waters only a couple of months before. The move was a deterrent measure, according to Healey, who said that he deployed the submarine when he discovered that the Yantar hadn't just made its way into British waters, but was loitering suspiciously over some of the UK's most important undersea infrastructure. "Let me be clear," Healey told the UK Parliament. "This is a Russian spy ship used for gathering intelligence and mapping the UK's critical underwater infrastructure." That encroachment was so severe that it led to Healey changing Britain's normal rules of engagement for dealing with naval issues. What we saw in January 2025 was a typical response. A trespassing ship is detected, so Britain sends out a couple of its own, along with a helicopter, to demonstrate that it knows the ship is there and to follow it no matter where it tries to go in British waters. That response is usually enough. The Yantar wouldn't waste any time loitering over Britain's undersea infrastructure when it was being watched, because it knew it would force a response from Britain's Navy. What happened in November 2024 was far from typical. The Yantar was already in position. So Healey deployed multiple measures to deter the Russian spy vessel, including the HMS Tyne and the HMS Catterstock, a mine countermeasure ship. While Yantar isn't armed, it's suspected of undersea cable sabotage, making its presence a serious concern for the UK. Healey also scrambled the RAF to send aerial assets into the skies to watch the Russian ship, and sent the surveillance ship RFA Proteus to watch the Russian vessel and shadow its movements. But unbeknownst to Russia, Healey also deployed a submarine. "I want to confirm to the House that I authorized a Royal Navy submarine, strictly as a deterrent measure, to surface close to Yantar to make it clear that we had been covertly monitoring its every move," said the UK's Defence Minister. Britain was sending a message. "Long before you saw our on-sea response, we could have sunk your spy ship any time we wanted." Healey even made that much clear, concluding his statements by adding, "I also want President Putin to hear this message. We see you, we know what you're doing, and we will not shy away from robust action to protect this country." Healey also emphasized that the UK is cooperating with its NATO allies to track any and all spy ships Russia might use to learn more about Britain's defenses. The one thing that Healey didn't mention was the type of submarine Britain used. The Warzone, or TWZ, believes it has the answer. Though the submarine wasn't named, it said that the vessel would have had to have been one of Britain's Astute-class subs. So what makes the Astute class such a threat to the Yantar and other Russian spy ships? Measuring 318 feet long and crewed by 110 Navy personnel, the Astute class is Britain's main nuclear-powered attack submarine. It was designed by BAE Systems, with the UK having 7 of these powerful submarines in its arsenal. The Astute is one of the first nuclear submarines to have been designed to be built using a 3D computer-aided environment, and it's a major threat to any ship on the surface. It can stay in the water for up to 90 days, reaching speeds of 29 knots to quickly approach surface vessels like the Yantar. However, the real danger of the Astute is that it doesn't need to get particularly close to a surface vessel to cause damage. Its precision munitions can strike home on a target from a range of over 621 miles. For context, the English Channel is 150 miles at its widest and 350 miles long, well within the Astute's strike range. If deployed in January, it could have targeted the Yantar before it even reached the channel. That range comes from the powerful weapons on board the submarine. The Astute-class vessels are equipped with Tomahawk Block 4 cruise missiles, each of which has a TERCOM terrain contour mapping-assisted inertial navigation system. That's a complicated way of saying that the Tomahawks can combine radar measurements with pre-implanted terrain mapping data to locate their targets. Those missiles actually have a range of 1,000 miles and can reach top speeds of 550 miles per hour, giving the Yantar no chance of avoiding it should Britain have chosen to fire. Add Spearfish torpedoes, capable of traveling up to 40.3 miles to give the sub a close-range option, and mines to that equation, and the Astute is more than capable of taking out any Russian spy ship. Of course, that's not how the UK used the submarine when Russia encroached on its waters. It wanted to send a message, not escalate its long-standing issues with Putin. That's why Britain chose to have the submarines sneak up on the Yantar and surface nearby. It was a warning. We could have destroyed you at any time. Now get out of our waters. The Yantar got the message. TWZ says that the spy ship quickly moved on from the position in which it was loitering, though it still tried to conduct a little more surveillance. Under the watchful eye of Britain's Astute-class submarine, Russia's ship moved into the waters east of Dublin, Ireland, raising concerns that it may have been scouting for the location of key pipelines and cables that connect the UK to Ireland. It didn't stay long. Ireland's offshore patrol vessel L.E. James Joyce escorted the Yantar out of the Irish exclusive economic zone, while the Irish Air Corps monitored its movements. So how did the UK know this spy ship was in its waters in the first place? We already have our answer from the Royal Navy's comments about these missions. In January 2025, Britain's Navy was working alongside its NATO partners, so it knew the Yantar was coming and was prepared to escort it away as soon as it was found. It's likely that similar information passed between NATO allies during the November submarine surfacing incident. However, there's another interesting aspect of the Yantar that makes it much easier to track than other spy vessels. It's equipped with an Automatic Identification System, or AIS. This system broadcasts the ship's position at regular intervals, with that position being tracked by transceivers on other ships. The data collected is then published by several online ship tracking services, which means the Royal Navy could watch the Yantar as it moved and get into the perfect position to intercept. However, AIS isn't a real-time tracking system. It relies on ship transceivers, which means the Yantar would have to be in range of another ship for its location to be discovered. The ship's location had been picked up about 23 hours earlier in Belgian waters during the January incident, giving the UK a good idea that it was on its way to the English Channel. Combine that with constant monitoring by NATO partners and it's clear that Britain's message, both in January and November, was 100% accurate. It had eyes on the Yantar and it knew exactly what it was doing. That all leads us to another set of questions. Just what is the Yantar, and why does the UK consider it such a threat? The vessel certainly isn't dangerous in an attacking capacity. It's a Russian research vessel that's been in operation since 2015 and doesn't appear to be equipped with any weapons. That means it's not a warship, which is likely a deliberate choice by Russia. Sending a frigate or corvette into British waters would cause an escalation that could lead to weapons being fired. If the Yantar has no weapons, Britain would have looked like the bad guy if it fired on the ship using submarines or other vessels. What the Yantar does likely have is a stock of mini-submersibles. The New York Times reported on these submersibles back in 2015, claiming that the Yantar has at least 2 of them on board that it can deploy at any time. Popular Mechanics repeated the claim a couple of years later, adding that the mini-subs and the Yantar itself are likely being operated by Russia's main Directorate of Underwater Research, which is essentially the country's underwater spying division. The Yantar is essentially a mothership for these tiny submarines, Popular Mechanics claims, and it has built-in hangars installed for stowing these submarines out of sight until it needs to use them. Of course, the presence of these submarines alone wouldn't be enough to prove that the Yantar is a spy ship. Many similar underwater research vessels utilize similar submarines to explore the deep ocean. However, when you combine this submersible capability with the many times the Yantar has been caught in waters that it has no right exploring, you start to see a pattern of Russia sending the ship into sensitive areas. The pattern goes back almost a decade. The Yantar has been found loitering near undersea telecommunications cables ever since it was introduced into the Russian Navy in 2015. That very same year saw it sail around the coast of Guantanamo Bay, which is perhaps best known as the place where the US maintains a prison camp for inmates it considers to be threats to national security. In October 2015, the Yantar was exploring again, this time in Norwegian territorial waters. And the list keeps going. Russia's supposed research ship managed to somehow find its way to Greenland in the summer of 2016 and was active in the eastern Mediterranean a year later, where it loitered around an undersea cable that links Israel to Cyprus. Fast forward to 2020 and the ship was found lurking around more undersea cables, this time off the coast of Rio de Janeiro in Brazil. The Brazilian Navy caught up to the crew and questioned the presence of the ship in Brazilian waters. All of the Russian sailors avoided definitively answering any questions and turned off their identification system when the Brazilians landed, which is suspect behavior at the best of times and downright suspicious given the Yantar's location. The November 2024 submarine incident wasn't even the first time that Russia's spy ship explored the Irish seas. August 2021 saw it spotted off the coast of Ireland, sailing parallel to the AE Connect 1, which was a submarine communications cable. Russia's ship spent close to 24 hours in that position before sailing onto the English Channel. 2 years later, it was spotted off the coast of Norway and shadowed by the Norwegian Navy. This time, the Yantar was operating without the AIS we mentioned earlier, a clear and intentional effort to avoid being tracked as it entered another country's waters. The November 24 and January 25 incidents in British waters can't be explained away by Russia. There's a clear pattern here. The Yantar constantly finds itself in the vicinity of underwater telecommunications cables and power lines. It has a history of trying to hide what it's doing, either by turning off its AIS or due to its crew refusing to clearly answer questions when it's caught in the act. Add the mini-submersibles believed to be stowed away in the ship, and it's clear what Russia is trying to pull. It's scanning deep waters to find key infrastructure used by Russia's enemies. The question now is simple: why? Russia tries to claim that it's using the vessel to collect data on the ocean environment, but the evidence suggests otherwise. It's sailing and loitering in British waters because it's trying to pinpoint the locations of key underwater cables. We already mentioned the submarine telecommunications cables near Ireland, which were the likely target in November 2024, but the English Channel is no stranger to these cables. It's home to the first subsea cable that's connected the UK with France for over 2 decades, the cross-channel system. That cable is a key part of the internet backbone running through both countries, and it represents the lowest latency fiber connection between the Equinix LD4 hub in Slough, England, the Intertion PAR 3 hub, and the Equinix PA7 located in Paris, France. Essentially, the cable is important for providing high-speed internet in both the UK and France. There's also evidence that there's a cable running underneath the sands of Cornwall, which is in Britain's south, that provided the most powerful physical internet connection between the two countries back in 2009. And in 2020, Britain's national grid powered up a cable in the English Channel, again connected to France, that enables the two countries to share surplus energy with one another. Similar cables are also installed in the seabed near Denmark and Norway to link the UK's national grid with clean energy supplies in those countries. You're probably starting to draw your own conclusions now. All of these cables are key to the UK's power and internet infrastructures. If Russia is able to locate them, which is clearly what it's trying to do with the Yantar, it will be able to target those cables should Russia ever find itself at war with Britain. Taking out those cables could cut power to multiple areas of the UK and damage internet connections the country's military uses to communicate and its people need to keep Britain's economy running. No wonder the UK was so quick to send submarines and other vessels to confront the Yantar in November and January. Russia is trying to uncover Britain's weaknesses, and what might it do once it finds these undersea cables? We barely even need to ask that question because we're already seeing Russia carrying out its plans elsewhere. Sabotage. While Russia still seems to be scoping out Britain's underwater cables, it may be actively attacking those used by other nations. On January 27th, less than a week after the Yantar was discovered in British waters again, Sweden announced that it had seized a ship named the Vejen. Flying the Maltese flag, the ship is believed to have been involved in a sabotage operation in which it deployed its anchor and destroyed an undersea cable in the Baltic Sea. A Bulgarian shipping company named Navigation Maritime Bulgara later claimed that the Vejen was one of its ships and that it had dropped its anchor due to high winds. There was no malicious intent, the shipping company claims. What does this have to do with Russia? There's a suggestion that the Vejen wasn't the only ship in the region at the time the damage was caused, with Latvia claiming that it saw a total of 3 all in the same area. But perhaps even more intriguing is the idea that Russia is carrying out its sabotage operations using what the conversation calls a shadow fleet of vessels that aren't owned by Russia but are essentially under its control. The months prior to this incident had seen several instances of ships seeming to deliberately drag their anchors in waters that are home to undersea cables in the Baltic Sea. That's precisely what the Vision is accused of doing. And if it's found to have dragged its anchor by the ongoing Swedish investigation, that immediately rubbishes any claims that the ship simply dropped its anchor to stabilize in high winds. It was involved in sabotage. So Russia's tactic seems to be clear: send its own ships out, mostly spying ships operating under the guise of research, to scan for undersea cables in another country's territory. When it finds them, rather than deploy its own ships and take the blame for its sabotage operations, it uses its shadow fleet to do the damage for it, allowing it to deny all involvement. Britain's reaction to the presence of the Yantar in the English Channel and Irish waters gained even more context with that strategy revealed. The UK had to surface its submarine to show its strength in the face of Putin using his ships to spy in their waters. It also had to do it to show Russia that it understands the games Russia is trying to play. The question now is whether Russia is going to use a ship from its shadow fleet to attack cables in British waters. Do you think it will? And what do you think about Britain revealing that it deployed a submarine to intercept the Yantar, along with the other ships and aerial assets it used to show Russia that it knew what Putin was up to? It's January 2024, and General Patrick Sanders stands before an audience at the International Armoured Vehicles Exhibition in London. However, the general doesn't merely have vehicles on his mind. A much bigger problem troubles him: Russia. During his speech, Sanders stresses that the UK needs to achieve a mental shift, particularly when it comes to the British public and its collective preparedness for war. Conscription still isn't on the table, the general says, but the country's army as it stands right now isn't strong enough. He tells the audience that the UK needs to modernize and may even have to build a citizen army that's ready for a land war. He then delivers a chilling warning. Within the next 3 years, it must be credible to talk of a British army of 120,000 folding in our reserve and strategic force, but this is not enough. Why will it not be enough? Again, Russia. Sanders' speech rattles a few cages at 10 Downing Street. Former Prime Minister Rishi Sunak dismisses Sanders' words, saying that presenting hypothetical scenarios isn't helpful to anybody. That especially goes for the general's comments that the Ukraine war has shown that it's not regular armies that win wars, it's citizen armies. The UK should follow in Ukraine's footsteps, he argues, or at the very least, be mentally prepared to do so. His message is clear: the UK has no choice but to prepare for war with Russia. And his statements lead to some questions. Why does the UK have to prepare, and just how credible are Sanders' claims? Assuming the general is correct, how would the UK fare if it faced Russia today? And what, if anything, is it doing to prepare for a war with one of the world's largest militaries? To begin answering those questions, we must first dive into the relationship between the UK and Russia. Both nations have essentially been at peace since the end of the Crimean War and have been allies fighting alongside each other in 2 world wars. Given that somewhat friendly history, how have relations between the two countries fractured to the point where the UK needs to be ready for war? It all starts with the rise of Vladimir Putin. Putin's rise to the Russian presidency in 2000 marked the end of the cooperative relationship the UK enjoyed with Russia following the end of the Cold War. That end didn't come immediately. Rather, a series of events slowly transformed the relationship from one of cooperation into one of confrontation, perhaps starting with an infamous incident, the 2006 murder of Alexander Litvinenko. A former officer with the Federal Security Service, or FSB, Russia's replacement for the KGB, Litvinenko was a Russian spy who had become critical of his country. In 1999, Litvinenko earned the FSB's ire when he claimed that the agency had begun colluding with the Russian mafia and was responsible for several apartment bombings in Russian cities that Russia then used to justify the Chechen War. But perhaps more dangerous to Litvinenko, according to a 2016 report by The Guardian, was that he had a personal vendetta against Putin. When Putin became the director of FSB in 1998, 2 years before he ascended to the presidency, Litvinenko met with him to argue against the corruption he saw in the agency. Putin listened to him make his case and did nothing, creating bad blood between the two. It's likely this incident that prompted Litvinenko to leave FSB and flee to Britain in 2000, where it's believed he started working for the MI6 spy agency and developed associations with former Chechen leader Akhmed Zakayev and a Russian oligarch named Boris Berezovsky, both critics of the Kremlin, both enemies of Vladimir Putin. If those associations weren't bad enough, Litvinenko was also not shy about attacking Russia's president. In July 2006, he wrote an explosive article in which he claimed Putin was a pedophile who had abused his position as the head of FSB in the late 1990s to destroy videotape evidence of himself having sex with underage boys. Add to that further accusations that Putin was responsible for the October 2006 murder of a Russian journalist named Anna Politkovskaya, and Litvinenko had placed himself on Putin's hit list. It wouldn't be long before Putin enacted his revenge. In November 2006, Litvinenko was killed inside the UK through the use of a poison named polonium-210, which had been administered to a cup of tea. The inquest that followed revealed that Litvinenko was being paid by MI6, though the specific terms of his employment weren't revealed, and that he had been targeted by assassins. Specifically, the two men he met for that fateful cup of tea, Andrei Lugovoy and Dmitry Kovtun, were accused of being the men who administered the poison. However, they weren't acting alone. The inquest revealed that Putin likely greenlit the order to kill Litvinenko. The assassination triggered a turning point in UK and Russian relations, with the UK being incensed over the fact that Russia would kill somebody on British soil. In addition, Russia had been uncooperative with the investigation and even refused to extradite one of the suspects. Several Russian diplomats were expelled from the country in response to the killing, along with the UK ending its intelligence cooperation with Russia and freezing some of its assets. If nothing else, the incident showed the UK that Putin was willing to violate the country's laws to get what he wanted. Litvinenko's assassination wouldn't be the last time this happened. In March 2018, a Russian double agent named Sergei Skripal was poisoned in the UK. A former officer with Russia's GRU agency, a military intelligence unit, Skripal and his daughter were found slumped on a park bench 8 years after arriving in the UK as part of a spy swap deal in 2010. Both survived. Two Russian men, Alexander Petrov and Ruslan Borisov, were accused of the crime, and details soon emerged that demonstrated the covert nature of their attempted assassination. Skripal was poisoned using a Russian-made military-grade nerve agent, with the poison having been applied through the squirt of a perfume bottle. Russia denied all involvement. It claimed that rogue elements had somehow gained access to the nerve agent and had used it without the Kremlin's knowledge. Britain's then Prime Minister Theresa May gave Putin 24 hours to prove his claims, which he failed to do so in the eyes of the British government. By March 2018, the UK was saying that there was no alternative conclusion other than the Russian state was culpable for the attempted murder of Sergei and Yulia Skripal. Another attack on citizens inside the UK, and yet another incident that further soured the relationship between Britain and Russia. The Guardian claimed in 2018 that the incident plunged the relationship between the countries to its lowest depths since the 1980s and the cruise missile crisis. But those relations would reach new depths in February 2022. On February 17, 2022, the UK created new legislation that would give its ministers the power to impose fresh sanctions on Russia's businesses and oligarchs. The decision came in the wake of growing tensions in Europe as Putin appeared to be gearing up to invade Ukraine. About a week later, Russian soldiers started a war that continues to rage to this day. The UK joined the rest of the Western international community in condemning the war and used its new powers to levy sanctions. It also began supplying aid to Ukraine, along with many other countries, with Britain's contributions having reached $54.2 billion in value as of July 2024. All of this backstory matters because it paints a picture of the two countries that have experienced continued fracturing of their relationship over the last 24 years. Through his assassination attempts, Putin has shown that he not only lacks respect for the UK and its laws, but that he's willing to deploy agents into the country to get what he wants. He has set a precedent. Russia has operated in Britain before, and it may well do so again. Only this time those operations would escalate into full-scale war. Assassinations, secret plots, and sanctions combined do not create an atmosphere in which that war would occur. It's what's happened since Russia invaded Ukraine that has led the UK to the point where it needs to prepare. Take the repeated threats from Russia as an example. In February 2024, Russia's former president Dmitry Medvedev commented on the concept of Russia returning to the borders it had in 1991. Doing so would be untenable, claimed Medvedev, who now serves as Russia's Security Council head, as it would mean Russia would have to give up the territory it's taken in Ukraine, as well as Crimea and Chechnya. Speaking on Telegram, a social media platform that's popular in Russia, Medvedev issued a chilling threat. Attempts to return Russia to the borders of 1991 will lead to only one thing: towards a global war with Western countries using the entire strategic arsenal of our state. Medvedev then claimed that any attempt to return to those borders would represent the West forcing a direct and irreversible collapse of Russia, before he built on his strategic arsenal comments. Threats were levied against Kyiv, Washington, Berlin, and London, with Medvedev claiming all four have long been included in the flight targets of our nuclear triad. Better to return everything to how Russia wants it, demanded Medvedev, or Russia will return it themselves, with maximum losses for the enemy. The context here is simple. Russia would be prepared to use nuclear weapons to strike Britain if the UK takes part in any concerted effort to force Russia to return to its old borders. Suddenly, General Sanders' comments about the need to be prepared are cast in a new light. Perhaps they're not a case of scaremongering, but instead the statements of a man who has seen enough to know that Russia is a clear threat. Sanders sees the deterioration of the relationship between Russia and Britain, with Medvedev's nuclear threats only confirming that he's likely right to be worried. Speaking of those nuclear threats, just what would Britain face if Russia pushed the nuclear button? In 2023, the Arms Control Association, or ACA, estimated that Russia has a stockpile of 5,580 nuclear weapons. About 1,200 of these have been retired, meaning they're no longer in active stockpile and are awaiting dismantling. Of course, given that they aren't dismantled yet, those nukes could still be used if Russia felt the need. However, more worrying for Britain are the 1,549 strategically deployed nuclear warheads. These are warheads that are currently installed on ballistic missiles and ready to launch at a moment's notice. It's unknown how many of that 1,549 are directed at Britain. However, we do know that Russia easily has enough nuclear weapons to level the United Kingdom. In October 2022, the UK-based Sky News ran a report in which it examined the threat that Russia's nuclear weapons pose. General Sir Richard Barrons, a British defense expert, is quoted when commenting on Putin's decision to place his nuclear deterrent forces on high alert in March 2022. Speaking about Russia's weapons, he claimed, "The warhead at the front of it has a yield between 300 and 800 kilotons. It would take just one of these nuclear weapons to destroy London," Barrons says. The UK isn't helpless on the nuclear front. The ACA highlights that it has 224 nukes of its own, plus it's allied with France and the United States, which are both NATO members and nuclear states that would come to Britain's defense if it was attacked on its own soil. But by that point, it would be too late for Britain. Russia has more than enough nuclear weapons to destroy all of the UK's major cities. Of course, these are far from the only nuclear threats that Russia has thrown around. It has a long history of using the threat of nukes to try and get its way, dating back to the Cold War era. Yet another nuclear threat, albeit one made in response to the possibility of Russia losing its current borders, may not be enough to convince Britain that it needs to prepare for war. But Medvedev's is far from the only threat made by Russia to the UK. During a state visit to Ukraine in May 2024, former British Foreign Secretary David Cameron committed to delivering at least $3 billion in military aid annually to Ukraine for as long as is required. However, that wasn't the headline from the visit. Instead, it was a single quote that made waves. "Just as Russia is striking inside Ukraine, you can quite understand why Ukraine feels the need to make sure it's defending itself." The quote was taken as Cameron's indirect way of permitting Ukraine to do something it had previously been unable to do: use British-provided weapons to attack Russia on its own soil. While Cameron's comments provided room for doubt, further comments made by new British Prime Minister Keir Starmer removed that doubt entirely. Speaking to Bloomberg journalists on July 9, 2024, Starmer claimed that it was up to Ukraine to decide how it would use British weapons, including the long-range Storm Shadow missiles the UK has been sending. Those missiles can travel for 155 miles, far enough for Ukraine to launch them from within its own territory to strike at Russia behind the front lines of the war. Russia was incensed. In the wake of Cameron's comments, Moscow summoned Britain's ambassador to Russia to the Foreign Ministry to deliver a message. Any strikes made by Ukraine on Russian territory using weapons supplied by the UK would force retaliatory strikes on British military facilities, both in Ukraine and elsewhere. The implication is that elsewhere could mean on British soil. Yet another threat, and yet another justification for General Sanders' comments that Britain needs to prepare. The UK didn't backpedal on Cameron's statements in the wake of Russia's threats, with Starmer's July 2024 comments only adding fuel to the fire. Russia argues that Britain is needlessly escalating tensions. The UK's refusal to back down means that the threat of war between the two countries is higher than ever. However, it's not just direct threats against Britain that could lead to the UK and Russia going to war. It's Putin's threats against British allies. In January 2024, the British government released a risk analysis that claimed there is a 1 in 4 chance that Russia will launch an attack on a British ally within the next 2 years. That analysis came just days after General Sanders' warnings and the government's shooting down of those warnings, with the report describing Russia as an adversary state throughout. The report claimed that there was a 25% chance of Russia attacking a non-NATO ally, such as Sweden. Of course, Sweden has since become a member of NATO, potentially reducing the possibility of such an attack. But if it were to occur, Britain would find itself going to war not because it was attacked directly, but because it was bound to do so by Article 5 of the NATO Convention. The article essentially states that an attack on one NATO member's soil is treated as an attack on all members, with those who aren't being attacked duty-bound to come to the defense of the country that's being targeted. The message here is simple. Russian aggression toward countries like Sweden, Finland, or the Baltic states of Lithuania, Estonia, and Latvia could mean war between Britain and Russia. NATO hasn't lowered these tensions. If anything, it's exacerbated them with the creation of Operation Steadfast Defender 2024. Touted by NATO as the organization's largest military exercise since the Cold War, the joint effort saw 90,000 troops from all of NATO's 32 members converge on Europe to conduct a host of military exercises between January and May 2024. The exercises were split into two parts. First, the United troops would carry out a series of exercises focused on securing the Atlantic Ocean through to the Arctic Ocean. From there, ground-based troops would move across Europe, traveling from the north of the continent through its center and finally into Eastern Europe. NATO's stated goal was simple: demonstrate the organization's ability to defend every inch of its territory. The message to Russia was also clear, as NATO's exercise was designed to showcase that its forces are ready and waiting to fight should Russia launch an attack on a NATO ally. The UK was among the most heavily involved nations in Operation Steadfast Defender, as it sent 16,000 troops, a little under a fifth of the NATO total, and reinforced its commitment to collective defense. Once again, we see an escalation of tensions. Putin has repeatedly warned NATO nations not to get involved in his war against Ukraine. However, Russia's continued aggression has prompted many NATO nations, including the UK, to take stock of their defensive strategies in preparation for what some see as an inevitable war. This collective escalation could place the UK in a position where it has no choice but to go to war with Russia to support other NATO members. Finally, there's one more suggestion that the UK needs to gear up for war with Russia. Its own people think that war is inevitable. That's according to a YouGov poll conducted in February 2024, which quizzed Britons on whether or not they believed the country needed to get ready for a global conflict. Over half, 53%, believe that there will be another world war in the next 5 to 10 years, with 15% claiming that such a war is very likely. Another 38% say that war is somewhat likely, while a further 16% simply don't know one way or the other. On the plus side, 44% of those polled believe that the UK and its Western allies would prevail in a war over Russia and its allies, compared to just 13% who think Russia would win. Where does all of this leave the UK? One of its leading generals claims that war is coming. Since 2000, Britain has seen its relationship with Russia deteriorate enormously, to the point where the UK is referring to Russia as an adversary state in official reports. Moscow has levied threat after threat at Britain in 2024, ranging from mentions of nuclear weapons to warnings of strikes on British military facilities and equipment if Ukraine uses British weapons inside Russia. NATO appears to be preparing for war, having conducted one of the largest cooperative exercises ever during the first half of 2024. And Britain would likely be a major part of that war. And as YouGov reveals, most Britons appear to side with General Sanders and his belief that the war is coming. All of which brings us to another question. Is the UK ready to fight Russia? The simple answer appears to be no, or at least it's not ready to fight Russia alone. Every year, Global Firepower, or GFP, compiles a list of 145 countries with militaries, ranking them based on over 60 factors to determine which is the strongest. The United Kingdom performed well in the 2024 version of this list, achieving a ranking of 6th out of 145. The problem is that Russia came second, and it overpowers the UK in practically every department. Russia has 1.32 million active military personnel, compared to 184,860 in the UK. Russia also has over 1 million more reserve personnel, though the UK comes in with an impressive 924,000. The UK's defense budget is about half of Russia's, and its air force is far smaller, with 664 aerial assets compared to Russia's 4,255. Russia has more tanks, over 130,000 more armored vehicles, and crucially, a navy that contains 664 more assets than the UK's Royal Navy. The last point is important. Britain's island status means that a conventional war would require Russia to attack via sea. Adding to all of this is the nuclear issue discussed earlier, as Russia has enough nuclear weapons to decimate the UK if conventional warfare doesn't do the job. General Sanders recognizes Britain's comparative weakness. In July 2024, he warned that NATO, and Britain by extension, only had about 5 years to prepare for war with Russia. Honing in on Britain's defensive capabilities, he praised the UK's ability to combat cyber threats, as well as its ability to defend against terror attacks. But in a full-blown war, it will be found wanting. We have a huge gap in air defenses, the general claims, adding that Britain needs to ensure that its skies are protected with greater investment and that the undersea cables that we rely on are protected from Russian sabotage. In other words, Britain needs to spend more on its military. Which brings us to the final key question posed in the video. What is the UK doing to ensure it's ready for war with Russia? We've already seen some examples. For instance, the UK taking part in Operation Steadfast Defender 2024 is a purposeful effort to reinforce its defensive ties with dozens of other nations. Cooperative defense will form the majority of the UK's strategy against Russia, as it will lean on Article 5 of the NATO Charter to ensure that other powerful nations, such as France, Germany, and the United States, fight alongside it should Russia attack Britain on its own soil. The UK has also been busy signing security partnerships outside of NATO. For instance, 2017 saw it sign a trilateral submarine agreement that also involves the US and France, with 2021 bringing with it a similar agreement between the UK, the US, and Australia. Though these agreements don't compel any of the signees to come to the other's aid in times of war, the fact that they exist at all suggests that Britain will have plenty of allies on which it could rely during a war with Russia. Of course, allies alone won't win a war. The UK needs to prepare internally. It appears to be doing that by committing to the level of investment General Sanders believes is required. In April 2024, Chatham House reported that former Prime Minister Rishi Sunak had pledged to continuously increase Britain's military spending until it reaches 2.5% of gross domestic product, or GDP, by 2030. That would put it above NATO's 2% of GDP guideline, adding an extra £75 billion, or $96 billion, to Britain's defence budget over the next 6 years. Britain's July 2024 general election initially cast this budget in doubt. However, the Labour Party under Keir Starmer has reiterated Britain's intention to hit a 2.5% of GDP target, meaning military spending has survived a changing government. However, these budgetary increases may not be enough. The Institute of Fiscal Studies points out that the £75 billion pledge only works out if the UK intends to freeze its budget every year between 2024 and 30. In other words, a large amount of that money would have been accounted for within existing increases to UK defence spending, which is already at 2.3% of GDP. Taking that existing commitment into account, rising to 2.5% of GDP only adds £20 billion, around $25 billion, to the budget. While still a large amount of money, most of it will go toward plugging current funding gaps in Britain's military. That means it's having to spend more to play catch-up with Russia rather than spending to strengthen a fighting force that was already capable of winning a war. Nevertheless, the UK has been ordering and building more weapons since the outbreak of the Ukraine war. December 2022 saw it spend almost $300 million on thousands of next-generation light anti-tank weapons, or NLAWs, from Swedish manufacturer Saab. NLAWs can destroy a modern tank from a distance of up to 2,600 feet and would prove extremely effective in a ground war, given Russia's demonstrated reliance on tanks in Ukraine. A further $115 million was committed to buying L403A1 assault rifles, which feature stronger optical sighting systems than Britain's current rifles, as well as a muzzle signature reduction system. The UK government website suggests that up to 10,000 of these rifles may be purchased between 2023 and 33. Forces.net also reported that the UK is investing in drones capable of firing bullets costing as little as 13 cents per round in May 2024. The point here is that the UK is spending the money it has intelligently. It's seen Russia's extensive use of tanks in Ukraine and is investing in NLAWs and drones due to the success Ukraine has enjoyed with both. Purchasing new rifles also means Britain's soldiers would likely be better equipped than Russia's on the battlefield. However, it likely needs to spend more, and faster, if General Sanders' prediction of a conflict within 5 years is true. Right now, Britain's navy doesn't match Russia's in sheer size, even given the fact that much of the Russian navy is made up of patrol boats and smaller warships. Its aerial forces, as Sanders points out, are also not at the level they need to be to establish aerial dominance against Russia. Help from its allies could bolster the UK. But if it's to win against Russia, it likely needs to do more. That may mean an even greater commitment to spending, as well as increasing cooperation with its allies to ensure that collective defense is really what it's touted to be if Russia's aggression extends to Britain's shores. But what do you think? Does the UK really need to prepare for a war with Russia, or is General Sanders focusing on a future that's unlikely to happen? What else should Britain do to bolster its military? The UK can destroy Russia in just 55 minutes, and Putin knows it. That's why he's desperate to make Britain flinch. After UK-supplied Storm Shadow missiles struck deep inside Russian territory, Putin fired off his usual threats, even hinting at targeting the UK with Russia's newest ballistic missile. But here's the thing Putin doesn't seem to get. The UK isn't scared. While Russia talks a big game, the UK has the power to back up its words, and it's ready to remind the Kremlin of the consequences if they cross the line. With nuclear submarines that can strike Moscow before anyone has time to react, the UK isn't just a target, it's a nightmare for Russia. In this video, we're breaking down why Putin's threats are all bark, why the UK remains unshaken, and how Britain's submarines could change the game in just 55 minutes. The story begins with President Joe Biden finally lifting the restriction on US-supplied long-range weapons to strike deep into Russian territory. As soon as Biden gave this much-awaited green light, the US and France followed suit, permitting the use of their Storm Shadow and Scalp cruise missiles, which are practically the same weapon. And Ukraine wasted no time. The permission officially came on November 17, 2024. On November 20th, Ukraine fired the US-supplied ATACMS and the UK-supplied Storm Shadows on a fortified command post in the Kursk region. The attack reportedly killed Russian Lieutenant General Valery Solodchuk, injured a North Korean general, and killed hundreds of soldiers. Though Putin denied any deaths among the high-ranking officers, it's obvious that the November 20th attack severely rattled Putin. So he started firing off threats like warning shots. In a televised address, reserved for moments Putin deems critical, he issued a stern warning to the US and UK, accusing them of escalating the war in Ukraine. The message was simple: supply weapons used against Russia, and Russia will retaliate resolutely in a mirror way. He even floated the idea of targeting military facilities in these countries, a dangerous escalation designed to rattle Western resolve. During the same address, Putin boasted about testing a new missile, the Oreshnik, claiming that it's fast enough to evade any air defenses. Reportedly traveling at 10 times the speed of sound, the missile instantly became yet another tool in his arsenal of intimidation. Though the Oreshnik wasn't equipped with nuclear warheads when fired, Putin said that this weapon was comparable in strength to a nuclear strike, provided enough missiles were aimed at a target. But wait a second, Putin said that Russia would respond in a mirror way from now on. And as things stand, the UK wouldn't ever fire a nuclear weapon first. After all, the UK has historically showcased a commitment to a philosophy of deterrence, not aggression. So why are we even talking about a nuclear response from the UK? The answer lies in Russia's updated nuclear doctrine, which was unveiled only a day after the green light on long-range missile strikes into Russia. And as you'll soon see, the timing is no accident. With the new update, Russia has redefined sovereignty to mean much more than state survival. The term now includes regime stability, freedom from external influence, and even control of its information space. Any attack threatening these could now justify nuclear retaliation. And there it is, even a perceived external influence could now trigger a nuclear attack. The broad interpretation of this term blurs the line between existential threats and smaller-scale conflicts, creating a rather dangerous uncertainty. However, the doctrine does get rather explicit in specific parts, none of which inspire comfort. Russia's nuclear doctrine now explicitly states that if non-nuclear states like Ukraine act with the support of nuclear-armed allies like the UK, it could be seen as a joint attack, justifying a nuclear response. This language is a clear attempt to deter Western nations from arming Ukraine or escalating their military support. And that's not even the only potential trigger for a nuclear attack. The expanded list of triggers now includes military coalitions expanding near Russia's borders, large-scale exercises in proximity, threats to critical transport routes, and anti-satellite warfare. With this new list of triggers, Moscow ties even conventional acts to potential nuclear retaliation, injecting risk into every single confrontation. Ambiguity is Russia's weapon here. The doctrine doesn't spell out clear red lines, thus ensuring potential adversaries fear any miscalculation. It's about sowing division in NATO and keeping the West hesitant while shielding Putin's regime from external and internal threats. But do you know what else is rather ambiguous? The UK's nuclear deterrence strategy. While Russia wields uncertainty as a tool for destabilization, the UK embraces it to maintain peace and deter aggression. The UK's approach to deterrence deliberately leaves the when, how, and on what scale of its nuclear response undefined. This calculated vagueness is designed to keep adversaries guessing and complicate their decision-making. It's a subtle but effective way of ensuring the deterrent remains credible without being overly provocative. However, Professor Michael Clarke of the King's College London, the former Director General of the Royal United Services Institute, decided to break the UK's usual silence. In a YouTube interview, Clarke laid it all out, boldly, plainly, and a tad ominously. According to Clarke, if the order was given, a British nuclear submarine could obliterate Moscow in exactly 55 minutes. Yes, you heard that right, 55 minutes. And destroying Moscow means destroying Russia because, let's face it, the Kremlin isn't just the symbolic heart of the nation, it's its command center. Clarke then explained how this sheer scale of destruction was even possible. In their plan, around 40 warheads would immediately head towards Russia, each 6 times more powerful than the bombs dropped on Hiroshima and Nagasaki. Clark doesn't mince words. No matter how many warheads Russia's air defenses managed to intercept, enough would reach Moscow to leave it utterly devastated. It's just a straight-up technological fact, he claimed. Clark's point wasn't to escalate tensions, far from it. It was just to remind everyone that nuclear deterrence is mutual. He made it clear that while Russian figures like Sergei Karaganov talk cavalierly about using nukes against Europe, they conveniently forget that such aggression would invite catastrophic retaliation. The UK might not have thousands of nuclear warheads like Russia or even the US, but its independent nuclear deterrent is just as dangerous in its own right. With this in mind, let's break down the UK's nuclear arsenal and explain how it's capable of such destruction. As of 2024, the UK maintains a stockpile of approximately 225 nuclear warheads, with up to 120 of them considered operationally available for deployment. However, only about 40 warheads are deployed at any given time, distributed across 4 submarines. Though the UK's stockpile is relatively small in comparison to the 2 leading nuclear powers, the US with 5,748 and Russia with 5,580, the strategic value of its sea-based deterrent is immense. Plus, not everything is in numbers, as a huge chunk of the Russian arsenal is virtually useless, either outdated or poorly maintained. The UK's policy is built on the principle of maintaining a minimal credible deterrent, which focuses on ensuring the country's security without engaging in excessive nuclear proliferation. Despite this, the UK's arsenal has been growing in recent years. The 2021 Integrated Review, a comprehensive assessment of the UK's national security, raised the cap on the total number of nuclear warheads the UK can own to 260. This marked the first increase in the country's nuclear arsenal since the Cold War. The timing of this change was no coincidence. The change was introduced right around the time Russia increased its aggressive posture. This wasn't the first time a change in the UK's nuclear doctrine was tied to Russia. During the Cold War, the UK developed an independent targeting doctrine, which was based on the Moscow criterion. This means that the UK's nuclear forces were intended to be capable of targeting the Russian capital, Moscow, along with other major cities, to ensure any nuclear conflict would have catastrophic consequences for the aggressor. Though the specifics of the UK's current targeting policies aren't fully disclosed, it's widely believed that the Moscow criterion still forms the core of its nuclear strategy. And one thing's for sure, you shouldn't mess with a country that has tailored its nuclear strategy specifically to ensure your capital is on the line. Suddenly, the 55-minute window is starting to make a lot of sense, isn't it? But the UK isn't only laser-focused when it comes to the potential target of its nuclear arsenal. It also relies on a single delivery system. This is an unorthodox approach in the nuclear world, where nuclear triads are typically the norm. The biggest players in the nuclear space rely on a combination of land-based missiles, strategic bombers, and submarine-launched ballistic missiles to ensure survivability in the event of a first strike. The UK, however, places all its nuclear eggs in one basket: the Vanguard-class nuclear-powered ballistic missile submarines, or SSBNs for short. The Vanguard-class submarines comprise 4 vessels: 1. the HMS Vanguard, the lead boat; 2. HMS Victorious; 3. HMS Vengeance; and 4. HMS Vigilant. These 4 vessels are among the largest and most powerful in the Royal Navy's fleet, with a submerged displacement of 17,500 tons. This impressive displacement makes them twice the size of their predecessors, the Resolution-class submarines. Each Vanguard-class SSBN is approximately 490 feet in length, which allows for the accommodation of up to 16 Trident II D5 missiles. These missiles, the backbone of the nuclear deterrent, are capable of reaching targets up to 4,600 miles away, providing the UK with a truly global reach. For context, all 4 submarines are based at the HM Naval Base Clyde, which is some 25 miles west of Glasgow, Scotland, and some 2,300 miles from Moscow. With this distance and the stealth of these submarines, they can practically sneak up on Moscow without anyone noticing. Pair the stealth with remarkable endurance, and you've got a never-ending threat to Russia. You see, the Vanguard-class SSBNs are powered by pressurized water reactors, which allow them to circumnavigate the globe without refueling. They have the ability to remain submerged for months on end, with their only limitation being the amount of food and provisions aboard. Their propulsion system gives them a maximum submerged speed of 25 knots, allowing them to evade detection and maintain an element of surprise. But the real speed comes when the Vanguard-class submarines launch their payload. The Trident II D5 missile, which measures an impressive 44 feet in length and weighs around 130,000 pounds, can travel at a blistering speed of over 20,000 feet per second after just 2 minutes of the third stage motor setting in. That's more than 20 times the speed of sound, enough to turn any enemy target into a distant memory before they've even had a chance to react. The power of the Trident missiles is simply unmatched, allowing them to deliver warheads with devastating accuracy. Additionally, each submarine is equipped with advanced surveillance systems, including optronic masts and a combination of search and attack periscopes. This allows them to monitor and assess their environment without exposing themselves to detection. And let us tell you, these submarines are always watching. The core concept of the UK's nuclear strategy is the so-called Continuous At-Sea Deterrence, or CAS-D for short. This policy has been in place since 1969, and it ensures that at least one Vanguard-class SSBN is always on patrol. The same submarine will also carry a full load, up to 16 Trident missiles, ensuring it's ready to strike and strike hard at any time. This relentless patrol guarantees that there is never a moment when the UK's deterrent is vulnerable. But why is this deterrent exclusively sea-based? Well, this has been a strategic decision as much as a technological one. You see, Russia's military buildup, particularly in the nuclear domain, has been a focal point of concern for NATO countries, including the UK. Russia's ongoing modernization of its nuclear forces, combined with aggressive rhetoric and military posturing, particularly in the context of the Ukraine conflict, has reignited fears of nuclear escalation. But if Moscow were to strike, it would strike land-based capacities. The ability of the Vanguard-class submarines to remain hidden and undetectable ensures that even in the worst-case scenario, the UK will retain the capacity to retaliate decisively against any Russian threat. In other words, sea-based deterrence is designed to ensure that the UK maintains a credible and effective response to Russian aggression under any circumstances. In response to nuclear advancements, the UK has committed to modernizing its own arsenal, including upgrades to the Trident II D5 missiles and warheads. The UK's warheads are closely tied to US technology and infrastructure. However, the UK has always maintained that it retains full sovereignty over its nuclear forces, with the final say in their use remaining firmly in British hands. However, this doesn't mean that the UK would act alone in the case of a nuclear escalation. While the UK retains the ultimate authority over its weapons, British nuclear targets are coordinated with NATO's broader nuclear strategy, as part of the American Single Integrated Operation Plan, or SEOP. This means that in a general conflict, the UK's nuclear arsenal will be deployed in line with NATO's needs and objectives, which could extend beyond targeting Russia alone. Yet, should Russia decide to launch a nuclear attack against Britain, the response would be unequivocal. All of the UK's nuclear deterrent would be aimed squarely at Moscow. In other words, the UK wouldn't hesitate to deliver its weapons directly to the heart of Russia's capital, making Moscow not just a target, but the target. At the end of the day, it seems the UK is quite prepared to take on Russia. That's probably why the country remains largely unshaken by Putin's frequent nuclear threats. In the UK, these threats hold little weight in terms of influencing policy or public opinion. The UK, along with Scandinavian and Baltic states, sees Russia's nuclear saber-rattling as more of a tactical effort by the Kremlin to instill fear and influence the decision of Western politicians rather than a serious threat. Essentially, the consistent, reckless nature of Putin's nuclear rhetoric has lost its impact in the UK, where the resolve to maintain a strong nuclear deterrent remains unwavering. The only thing that could potentially threaten this deterrent is the fact that each vessel in the Vanguard fleet has surpassed its originally planned service life of 37 years or more, and it's starting to show. All Vanguard-class submarines are increasingly displaying signs of wear. Maintenance problems like the recent incident where a faulty depth gauge nearly caused an accident highlight the difficulties the UK faces in maintaining these aging vessels. Lengthy patrols and extended maintenance periods, such as the nearly 4-year delay for the HMS Vanguard's deep maintenance, further strain the fleet's operational capacity. That's why the UK is already planning for the next generation of SSBNs, the Dreadnought class. These new submarines, slated to enter service in the early 2030s, will carry the UK's nuclear deterrent well into the 2060s. With a new pressurized water reactor designed by Rolls-Royce, the Dreadnought-class submarines will be more powerful, efficient, and capable than their predecessors, ensuring that the UK remains at the cutting edge of nuclear deterrence technology. Despite a reduced missile capacity, each Dreadnought-class submarine will only carry 12 Trident II D5 missiles compared to the 16 on the Vanguard class. These new submarines will offer a more modern, efficient, and reliable platform, incorporating the latest technological advancements such as the quad-pack missile compartments. These compartments were jointly developed with the US Navy, and they will also be present in the Columbia-class SSBNs, designed to replace the Ohio class in the US. However, the transition to the Dreadnought class comes with its own set of challenges. The biggest is that these submarines aren't expected to enter service until the 2030s. If there are any delays, the Vanguard submarines may have to serve well beyond their anticipated lifespans. This could present challenges in terms of readiness and maintenance, and put added pressure on the UK to sustain its nuclear deterrent capabilities in a time of escalating tensions with Russia. As Russia continues to modernize and expand its nuclear forces, the need for a reliable and ready deterrent remains as critical as ever. So the UK must balance the continued operation of its aging Vanguard-class submarines with the timely deployment of the Dreadnought class, ensuring that it can maintain its strategic edge in an increasingly unpredictable world. As Putin slowly runs out of options, he might try something drastic, like a nuclear test or even hitting British military assets. And while that's certainly worrying, don't expect the UK to flinch. Remember, the UK has faced down Russian provocations before. In 2006 and 2018, when Russian agents tried to poison British citizens, the UK didn't hesitate to take action. It expelled dozens of Russian diplomats, shut down Russian organizations, and ramped up security. The message was clear: if you mess with us, there will be consequences. This means that even if Putin decides to attack British military installations, the UK won't sit idly by. It will treat this attack like the crime it is. Russia might think it can get away with something like this, but Britain has a track record of tracking down perpetrators, and the Kremlin won't be able to hide behind their cyber attacks or sabotage for long. As for any larger provocations or attacks, the British SSBNs are always ready, lurking beneath the waves, ready to deliver a decisive response. And deliver it in under an hour. But what do you think? Will we get to see the British SSBNs in action, or will diplomacy keep us from the brink? And what happens if Russia decides to test those red lines? Will the West finally take the leap and escalate first? Or will they continue to tiptoe around the edge? Since February 2022, the West has been steadily tearing down its own limits on aid to Ukraine. First it was tanks, then F-16 fighter jets. Even long-range missile strikes into Russian territory became fair game, all despite Putin's endless threats and chest-pumping against NATO. But one line has never been crossed. No Western troops on Ukrainian soil, ever, or so we thought. By late 2024, the rules of the game are shifting again. New alliances, bold proposals, and a desperate Kremlin are changing the conversation in ways we couldn't have imagined just months ago. Could British or other European troops be heading to Ukraine? And if they are, what role will they play? Let's break it all down. In early 2024, French President Emmanuel Macron raised eyebrows when he refused to rule out the idea of putting ground troops in Ukraine. He answered criticisms by saying that the West had lifted supposed taboos before, and that if it was necessary to ensure that Russia did not win the war and further threaten European security, so be it. Macron's comments were mostly waved off at the time, but as the year came to a close, a series of geopolitical developments took place that radically altered the previous status quo. What were they? The first significant change came in June. That month, Vladimir Putin made his first trip to the North Korean capital of Pyongyang in over 20 years. Putin and Kim Jong-un exchanged gifts such as limousines and a gigantic portrait of Putin. After the ceremonies, they agreed to a new mutual defense treaty, which was ratified in November. South Korean sources claimed that the treaty was a mirror image of their country's alliance with the United States. So what does that mean? Article 4 of the new agreement stipulates that, in case any one of the two sides is put in a state of war by an armed invasion, the other side shall provide military and other assistance with all means in its possession without delay. But there's a catch. This clause must be consistent with Article 51 of the United Nations Charter and the domestic laws of Russia and North Korea. Article 51 of the UN Charter says the member states have an inherent right of individual or collective self-defense. However, these conditions must be reported to the Security Council to take any time such action as it deems necessary in order to maintain or restore international peace and security. The South Koreans reported that these conditions are an escape hatch to give either country a way out of providing military obligations, with doubts about how seriously Moscow and Pyongyang would take the treaty. The mutual defense provisions were put to the test in August, when Ukraine launched a daring counter-invasion into Russia's Kursk region. While raids on Russian territory had occurred before, this marked the first time Ukrainian armed forces conducted direct ground operations, sending shockwaves through Moscow and causing Russia's currency to tumble. Struggling to respond, the Kremlin turned to its unlikely ally, North Korea. By mid-October, South Korean intelligence reported the arrival of 1,500 North Korean troops in Russia, with their numbers growing rapidly. Just weeks later, by late October, American intelligence sources confirmed that 3,000 North Korean troops were on Russian soil, a troubling sign of Pyongyang's willingness to support Putin's faltering war effort. But that wasn't the end of it. In early November, President Zelensky painted an even grimmer picture, claiming that the number of North Korean troops had swelled to 11,000. This raised alarms across the international community. By mid-November, security experts from multiple G20 nations warned that if ties between Moscow and Pyongyang deepened further, North Korea could send as many as 100,000 troops to bolster Russia's ranks. Were these troops only in Russia for training purposes? No. On November 5th, Ukraine reported clashing with these North Korean troops for the first time. The skirmish took place in the Kursk region. Ukrainian officials fear that as many as 50,000 North Korean and Russian troops collectively will take part in the counteroffensive. So far, North Korea's involvement has been limited to Russian territory. Since Ukraine moved a military force beyond Russia's border, this can be argued to be in line with the Mutual Defense Treaty between Moscow and Pyongyang. However, the increasing military cooperation between them created widespread international condemnation, and there's something more important at work. Russia is facing a dire demand for manpower. It suffered its single deadliest day of the war on November 12th, in trying to retake the Kursk region from Ukraine, when almost 2,000 troops became casualties, despite the presence of their North Korean allies. Putin is hoping that North Korea's sizable army will help him to meet his increasing demands for manpower. Technically, the new treaty does not obligate North Korea to fight in Ukraine, but that decision ultimately comes down to what Kim Jong-un wants, and that isn't exactly the best place for Ukraine to be in. The North Korean dictator might want to get his army some badly needed combat experience in an attempt to increase his leverage with the United States and South Korea at home. He could also be calculating that if he does Putin a solid, Putin will need to help him with his shopping list, which includes upgrades to his ancient air force, submarine and satellite technology, and improved missiles. All that for some expendable troops and ammunition. It seems like too good an offer for Kim Jong-un to pass up. North Korea's presence on the front lines leads to a question. If Russia can bring allied troops to fight in its war, or at least secure its territory, why can't Ukraine? Well, maybe it can. And there's a surprising proposal that comes from a place you might not expect. Something else happened in November after all. The second major geopolitical development occurred in the United States, coincidentally at the same time North Korean troops were attacking Ukrainian troops in Russia. On November 6th, Donald Trump won the US presidential election. He will become the 47th president of the United States on January 20th, 2025. His win was far more convincing than it was in 2016, giving him a mandate that he did not have back then. What will he do with it? That's the big money question everyone's talking about right now. The election of any new administration in Washington brings a degree of uncertainty about America's foreign policy direction, particularly when there's a changeover in the party alignment of the White House. On one hand, Trump supplied Ukraine with lethal weapons during his first tenure in office, including the Javelin anti-tank missiles that have proven so lethal to Russian armored columns and helped to prevent an early Russian victory. However, Trump insisted on the campaign trail that he would negotiate a deal to end the war between Russia and Ukraine immediately. Ending the war now will be bad for Ukraine, as Russia holds about 20% of its territory. About 3 million Ukrainian citizens live under the invaders' occupation. Russia has conducted savage war crimes in these territories, including widespread looting, rape, torture, and deportation of children to the Russian interior. The latter crime landed Putin an arrest warrant from the International Criminal Court in The Hague. In interviews, Trump has been coy about what his plan for Ukraine is, but his early cabinet picks could reveal clues about his intentions. Vice President-elect J.D. Vance has been a vocal critic of aid to Ukraine. In September, Vance said that a peace agreement would likely involve Russia keeping the territory it's taken. But others in the administration with more actual power than Vance leave the Ukrainians and their defenders more room for hope. Trump's Secretary of State designate, Florida Senator Marco Rubio, has been a staunch supporter of Ukraine, although he said on November 6th that the war had become a stalemate and that it was time to exercise common sense. Defense Secretary designate Pete Hegseth said the week before his nomination was announced that he rejected the idea that Putin would be more aggressive in Europe in the wake of a successful invasion of Ukraine, saying on a podcast that he did not believe that Russia would go much further than the Polish border. He also said that he didn't want the United States to intervene to the extent that Putin would feel the urge to use nuclear weapons. However, he also called Putin a war criminal with dreams of restoring the Soviet Union and sharply criticized the Biden administration for not giving Ukraine the equipment it needed fast enough. Like Trump, Hegseth has been vocally critical of NATO allies, who are not spending at least 2% of GDP on their defense, calling them outgunned, invaded, and impotent in his The War on Warriors book. Keep this part in mind, since it could reveal more about the new administration's strategy. Florida Congressman Mike Waltz, the incoming national security advisor, has generally been supportive about American aid to Ukraine, although he recently criticized a blank check approach to such assistance, and like Hegseth, insisted that European allies step up to shoulder more of the burden. Keep Waltz in mind too, he's going to be particularly important later. Following the November election, President-elect Trump called President Zelensky to express his support for Ukraine. During the call, Trump reportedly urged Zelensky to be ready for negotiations, signaling a potential shift toward diplomacy under the new administration. Either Elon Musk, who has been instrumental in supporting Ukraine's communications with Starlink satellites, also participated in the call, reiterating his commitment to aiding Ukraine. The conversation seemed to reassure Zelensky about continued US backing amid the evolving situation. On November 11th, the Washington Post reported that a phone call took place between Trump and Putin. Supposedly, the president-elect warned Putin not to escalate the war in Ukraine and reminded him of America's sizable military presence in Europe. The Kremlin denied the phone call took place. However, naked pictures of Melania Trump from her days as a model began to spread over Russian state television in the ensuing days, suggesting that Putin was trying to respond to the threat. A major tactical shift came when President Biden finally permitted Ukraine to use long-range missiles to strike targets deep inside Russian territory, explicitly in response to the increasing North Korean presence in the war. Ukraine was quick to use the ATACMS to hit military targets in the Bryansk region. Putin responded by loosening restrictions on his nuclear arsenal. The Biden administration is also spending the $61 billion aid package that Congress gave it before the election. Biden wants to spend it all before he leaves office. Notably, these decisions from the outgoing administration did not spark a protest from Trump or his intended national security team. Overall, Trump's intended appointees vary in their assessment of how much aid is appropriate, but two beliefs are generally consistent. The Biden administration was too weak in the face of Putin's aggression, and Europe must do more to take point in defending itself while the United States prioritizes other theaters. America's European allies seem to be getting the message and had anticipated it long ago. The United States has been the most important supporter of Ukraine by far, but it can afford to take a certain distance from the situation. European countries, on the other hand, are far more threatened. The Russian invasion of Ukraine has already forced European countries to increase their defense spending. The further Russia consolidates itself there, the more money they'll need to spend. But what if the danger becomes so acute that increased spending isn't enough? Here's where the possibility of troops comes into the picture. On November 12th, former British Prime Minister Boris Johnson said that if the United States stops its aid to Ukraine, Europe will need to ensure that Kyiv can continue its fight, including by deploying British troops to assist the Ukrainians. If Ukraine goes down, then we face an even bigger threat on our borders, the borders of the European continent wherever the democracies butt up against Russia. Our collective security will be really degraded by a resurgent Russia threatening all sorts of parts of Europe, and we will then have to pay to send British troops to help defend Ukraine. Perhaps in a tailored pitch to the incoming administration, Johnson, who Trump had a good relationship with, said that Russia getting away with its invasion of Ukraine would be detrimental not only to Europe, but to the countries in the South China Sea, where a bellicose China is thumbing its nose at international maritime law. Trump and his advisors continue to see China as the primary foreign policy challenge for the United States. In truth, there's nothing new about this. This has been the case in Washington's foreign policy thinking since President Obama's pivot to Asia strategy. Obama often criticized European allies for not contributing more to NATO's common defense, chastening them as free riders. Maybe that's about to change though. What if Emmanuel Macron's idea early this year about deploying Western troops to Ukraine becomes part of a peace plan, with America's blessing? That question goes hand in hand with the question about what to do about Ukraine's future. Ukraine is unlikely to agree to a peace that does not involve serious security guarantees, not the vague ones of the 1994 Budapest Memorandum that crumbled in 2014 and collapsed in 2022. Zelensky has been adamant that NATO membership is the only way for his country to have a durable guarantee of security against future Russian threats. But what if there was another option? 2 days after the election, Britain's The Telegraph reported that President-elect Trump was considering a plan to deploy European troops to Ukraine as part of a peace settlement. According to the report, staffers on Trump's transition team outlined the plan, which has been described as Trump's own strategy aimed at creating a buffer zone to secure a potential agreement. While details remain scarce, the idea signals a shift in how the incoming administration might approach the conflict. Reportedly, the embryonic peace plan would create an 800-mile-long demilitarized zone between the Russian and Ukrainian armies. The demilitarized zone would stretch from Ukraine's joint border with Russia and Belarus in the north, move south and east past Sumy and Kharkiv, and straddle the current front lines in eastern Ukraine, ending at Kherson. West of the demilitarized zone, the remainder of Ukraine would stay as an independent and sovereign state. Under the proposal, Ukraine would be prohibited from joining NATO for 20 years. In return, it would be pumped full of weapons to deter Russia from reigniting the conflict. Additionally, Ukraine's post-2014 government would remain in place, marking a significant failure for Russia in its attempt to overthrow Kyiv's leadership. The United States would continue to supply Ukraine with weapons under this agreement, but it would not send personnel or money. A member of the Trump transition team said to the Wall Street Journal that the United States would help with training and other support, but that the barrel of the gun is going to be European. We are not sending American men and women to uphold peace in Ukraine, and we are not going to pay for it. Get the Poles, the Germans, the British, and French to do it. To Trump's allies, the presence of European troops on Ukrainian soil would be a way to provide further security guarantees while also forcing NATO allies to pay more for their defense and take charge of European security. No reports of Trump's team contacting the British government or other European leaders about this idea have yet come out. For now, it's only one of a number of scenarios that have been proposed. Trump's team is keeping its options open. Is there even a realistic chance that something like this would come about in 2025, though? After all, coming to the table would require Russia's cooperation too. On October 30th, The Telegraph reported that Russia does not have many incentives to make peace at this time, as it likely thinks there's more territory to gain. Remember, Putin declared the annexation of Donetsk, Luhansk, Zaporizhia, and Kherson in late 2022, even when his troops were in retreat. Stopping now would be an admission of weakness to his people. As a result, Russia has offered little or no concessions to Ukraine so far. But that might not wind up mattering soon enough, because its casualties and equipment losses are ballooning. This is why it's found itself recruiting in Africa for soldiers, and now hoping that North Korean troops will take part in the fighting on Ukrainian soil. Perhaps for this reason, John Healey, the Labour government's defense secretary, downplayed the possibility that change in Washington will lead to the sudden end to America's aid to Ukraine. He expected the United States to continue supporting Ukraine for as long as it takes to prevail over Putin's invasion. Given the losses Russia is taking, Philip Ingram, a former intelligence officer in the British Army, expects that Trump will want to see concessions from Putin as part of the negotiating process. But as we've seen, Putin is not yet likely to concede anything. Ingram said that in response to Putin's intransigence, it's possible that Trump will see no other choice but to continue to provide Ukraine with even more lethal weaponry to force the Russian dictator to come to the table. But this isn't just informed speculation. There's good reason to believe that it will be part of Trump's strategy. Remember the incoming National Security Advisor Mike Waltz? A November 13th article in The Economist had him mentioning that if Putin refuses to come to the negotiating table, the United States might provide more weapons to Ukraine with looser restrictions on how they're used. Under such pressure, Putin would be under additional stress to bring the conflict to a conclusion. Waltz's language and Zelensky's cautious optimism suggests that the incoming administration will not abandon Ukraine on the spot as many leaders in Europe had feared. In fact, the Ukrainians believed that the worst-case scenario for the American presidential election was not a Trump victory, but another paralyzed, divided government of the sort that held up the aid between late 2023 and early 24. Zelensky and his officials had also long resented the restrictions that the Biden administration had placed on Ukraine's American aid. In his interview on the War and Politics 24 channel, Ingram believed that the new administration could bring more decisiveness to Washington, and not against Ukraine's interests as Europe had feared. Regardless of what the new administration does, President Macron said that these recent developments were a further reminder that Europe needed to take charge of its own security. He lamented that the story always seemed to involve some other entity, the American presidential election, the use of North Korean troops, how China would respond, and so on. Where was Europe's role in all of this? Throughout the war, European leaders have stressed more and more that the continent needed to be in the driver's seat with regards to its own security. This is something that the incoming administration would be in agreement with, as it looks to focus on the Indo-Pacific region first and the Middle East second. For now, European troops taking part in the actual war in Ukraine looks like a distant possibility. However, there is a growing likelihood that they could take part in enforcing whatever type of peace comes out of the conflict. There's a lot that's uncertain right now, but one thing is clear. Putin has failed in his pre-war plan to conquer Ukraine and install a puppet in Kyiv. Ukraine is not Belarus. European troops increasingly look like they will be part of making sure it stays that way. What do you think is coming next as 2025 dawns? Will North Korean troops be fighting on Ukrainian soil? What will the second Trump presidency mean for the conflict? The war in Ukraine could be entering a game-changing new phase, one that might pull NATO directly into the fight. After over 1,000 days of brutal conflict, both Ukraine and Russia are ramping up their offensives. Ukraine is striking deeper into Russian territory with newly approved long-range missiles, while Russia is desperately trying to push deeper into Donbass. But the real shocker, NATO might not stay on the sidelines for much longer. A recent report reveals that France and the UK have reignited talks about deploying troops to Ukraine. These aren't just symbolic discussions, they're about turning the tide of war and ending it once and for all. But what exactly are these talks about? How far are France and the UK willing to go? And could this be the beginning of NATO's next major step in Ukraine? Let's break it down. The Le Monde report doesn't reveal much detail, but it emphasizes growing defense cooperation between France and the UK, with Ukraine at the center of the conversation. While there's no direct mention of NATO troops on the ground, the talks suggest that both countries recognize the need for a stronger, united response to the conflict. French Foreign Minister Jean-Noël Barrot recently fueled speculation by calling on NATO allies to stop creating red lines. These lines were supposed to define the boundaries of acceptable actions during the war: no direct interventions, certain weapons off-limit, specific zones out of bounds. But over time, these red lines have lost their meaning. As the war drags on, both NATO and Russia have tested, bent, or outright ignored these so-called limits. What started as clear boundaries are now little more than political gestures, leaving the conflict without any real rules. And that's the question. With these lines disappearing, what happens next? Let's dive into how NATO's shifting stance could change the war's future. NATO's red lines were initially meant to contain Russia's aggression and prevent the conflict from spilling beyond Ukraine. The first was simple: stop Russia from invading Ukraine in the first place, with promises of economic sanctions as a deterrent. But when that failed in February 2022, sanctions became a reactive measure rather than a preventative one. Other red lines focused on preventing attacks on civilians and keeping the war's impact localized. But these too were broken as Russia's military ignored boundaries and targeted civilian areas. Calls for war crime investigations and arrest warrants followed, but immediate results remained elusive. Russia, meanwhile, has drawn its own red lines, dozens of them. Most of Putin's lines aim to limit NATO's involvement in the war, from prohibiting Western military aid to opposing donations of tanks, fighter jets, and long-range missiles. Time and again, Putin has threatened consequences, often invoking Russia's nuclear deterrence policy to bolster his warnings. But most of these lines have been ignored or carefully sidestepped by NATO. For example, when Russia objected to the US sending ATACMS missiles to Ukraine, NATO delayed the shipment, opting instead for UK-supplied Storm Shadow missiles. With a slightly shorter range of 160 miles, these missiles technically stayed under Russia's stated limit, at least for a time. Ukraine used Storm Shadows to strike Russian supply lines in Donbass and Crimea, forcing Russia to pull equipment back further out of range. This retreat ultimately led to NATO providing ATACMS anyway, escalating Ukraine's long-range capabilities even further. But the real way NATO has countered Russia's red lines? By simply calling Putin's bluff. Again and again, NATO has bet that Russia's threats wouldn't match its actions, and it's largely been right. But why has this gamble paid off? NATO had two good reasons for taking the risk. For one, Russia has effectively started the war by breaking one of the first red lines created between the two entities, and has repeatedly tried to threaten Ukraine further by announcing more and more constricting red lines of its own. In fact, the aggression Russia has been displaying against Ukraine started long before 2022 and, in fact, all the way back in 2014 with the annexation of Crimea. When the conflict escalated into a full-blown invasion, NATO believed, and perhaps rightly so, that Russia was going to play the part of the aggressor no matter how many red lines the organization broke. Secondly, Russia's red lines were pretty much always followed by vague comments suggesting NATO's actions would be considered geopolitical and strategic violations, prompting Russia to retaliate with nuclear weapons. However, as the first red lines were broken and Russia failed to mount responses directly against NATO, the alliance began to suspect that the threats were idle. One of the few ways that Russia could affect the EU economy was by disconnecting Central Europe from the Russian natural gas supply. However, the US and Norway stepped in to become major exporters to countries throughout Europe, effectively making NATO resource independent from Russia. Even more importantly, Russia's nuclear saber-rattling started getting less frightening with each new threat, particularly considering that NATO had already forced Russia to focus its economy and military on Ukraine rather than NATO. Additionally, the US, France, and the UK all maintain extensive nuclear deterrence strategies and launch discovery mechanisms. If Russia decided to use nuclear weapons against NATO, it would likely need to expend most, if not all, of its nuclear arsenal in one go to attempt to mount a devastating first strike against all three nations. The strategy apparently didn't appeal to Russia, considering that the US was sufficiently far away to mount a counterstrike of its own in time, one which would have a much more devastating effect on the Russian Federation comparatively. As a result, the discussion between the UK and France about directly assisting Ukraine, and their suggestion that NATO stop acknowledging red lines that Russia draws, as well as acting on an axis entirely separate from making red lines of their own, is evocative of a much deeper issue. NATO no longer has much of a reason to believe Putin's threats about what he might or might not do regarding NATO's ongoing assistance in Ukraine. To that end, Barrot hinted that both the UK and France are open about asking NATO to invite Ukraine into the alliance. This would give Ukraine the umbrella of defense that all other members enjoy due to Article 5, which states that members are obligated to provide direct military support to defend each other's territory. The possibility of Ukraine becoming a NATO member was a key part of what started the conflict in the first place. Russia considered NATO expansion a threat to its security, and invading Ukraine presented a multi-pronged solution to Russia's ongoing diplomatic, economic, and demographic problems. And with Ukraine beginning to align itself more and more with the West over the previous 2 decades and in the process shedding its connection with Russia as a former Soviet state, Putin used the threat of NATO membership as one of his justifications to invade. While Ukraine joining NATO would represent the accomplishment of one of the main goals of the current Ukrainian government, and has been for some time now, there are a few issues in that plan. First, NATO has a somewhat confusing and vague set of requirements when it comes to actually determining whether a country can join the alliance. One of the most frequently cited requirements is the country must enact economic and national defense reforms to bring itself in line with the rest of the alliance. However, the country also needs to resolve any outstanding political and territorial issues. The ongoing war in Ukraine would certainly be considered a non-starter with the second condition, since a part of Ukraine's territory is technically occupied and administered by Russia at the moment. Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky has noted that he'd be open to Ukraine becoming a NATO member, with the territory currently administered by the Ukrainian government immediately falling under NATO's protection. However, the occupied part of Ukraine would be under Russian administration until a more diplomatic solution could be implemented. Still, Zelensky is adamant about Ukraine joining NATO only if they recognize the previous Ukrainian borders, i.e. the ones that predate the 2022 invasion. That puts NATO in a difficult spot. Allowing Ukraine to join NATO while it's still in the middle of an active war could invoke Article 5 and call on its other members to respond. It would plunge most of Europe, the US, and Canada into a direct war with Russia, which could escalate quickly if Russian allies like China and Iran join its side. But if Ukraine does manage to sign an armistice and become a NATO member with only partial control of its territory, there's no telling how NATO could force Russia to cede the occupied areas. This has led NATO dividing itself into 2 camps. One of the camps is led by the US and Germany, the 2 largest economies of the alliance, which are adamant about maintaining the current involvement of NATO, only providing indirect assistance through donations to let the war reach its conclusion in time. The other camp seems to be led by France and the UK, which have started to propose increasingly radical approaches to dealing with the problem, including the aforementioned possibility of deploying their troops inside Ukraine. However, there's discord concerning this idea even inside those countries. The UK Foreign Secretary David Lammy has noted that the UK doesn't actually plan to send any troops away from its borders at this time. The latter part of the statement refers to the ongoing discussion on the members' possible elevated involvement in the conflict. The UK has so far been one of the largest donors to Ukraine, particularly of relatively modern long-range equipment such as the Storm Shadow missiles, as well as providing vital training for Ukrainian forces on handling Western military platforms and equipment. However, Lammy has stated that the country is adamant on maintaining its level of involvement in the conflict and not committing any of its soldiers to be deployed inside an active war zone. The somewhat contradictory statements from the UK and French authorities have put a dampener on possible military escalation on NATO's side. However, both governments have agreed that NATO has been ramping up its independent national defense efforts, particularly in Eastern Europe. This indicates that while NATO is not yet ready to commit to deploying its soldiers to Ukraine directly, the alliance has likely been creating plans for a possible conflict with Russia that would be fought entirely between Russia and NATO, independent of the current war in Ukraine. Again, this stems from the previous belief that NATO no longer sees Russia as trustworthy in obeying internationally recognized borders and agreements. The possibility of NATO's open conflict with Russia stems from a few countries having significant history with the Federation. In particular, these are the Baltic states Lithuania, Latvia, and Estonia, which belonged to the Soviet Union and were relatively quick to join NATO after their independence. The other is Finland, which shares a lengthy border with Russia and was previously at war with the Soviet Union during World War II, at which point it lost more than a tenth of its territory. Furthermore, Finland and Russia have recently clashed over border issues, particularly with regards to Finland claiming that Russia is using the ongoing migrant crisis in Syria and the Middle East to overload Finland's justice and immigration system through the Russia-Finnish border. This has led to Finland closing most of the border crossings with Russia, and Russia reneging on agreements that were already tenuous between the 2 nations. But there's another threat to NATO beyond Russia: internal conflict. The alliance needs its members to agree on sweeping changes in policy to decide on providing Ukraine with more military assistance. The US, especially under the current administration of President Joe Biden, has been trying to maintain a more passive approach, prohibiting Ukraine from using donated long-range weaponry in Russian territory until November 2024, 33 months into the conflict. The Biden administration finally changed course when it started becoming apparent that Ukraine's domestic weapons industry already managed to create long-range warfare solutions via drones. This had the benefit of bypassing more of Russia's red lines, while also allowing Ukraine to mount more pressure via its long-range offensive. The fact that Russia's nuclear threats on NATO actually worked to delay several important shipments of military aid showcased that the alliance was still hesitant due to its belief in how far Russia was willing to go in the war, at least as recently as a few months ago. And more recently, there's another big reason for NATO to start having more internal debates: the US administration change. With President-elect Donald Trump winning the 2024 US elections, January 20th, 2025 is the scheduled inauguration date for the new president to assume office. At that point, the current Biden administration and its policies are likely going to be reviewed and adjusted to be more in line with Trump's geopolitical aspirations. And Trump has previously been vocal about NATO members not pulling their weight. In Trump's mind, most countries in Western Europe have shirked their responsibilities to the alliance, particularly in regard to maintaining a sizable active force and providing the recommended national defense budget of 2% of their nation's GDP. And while some countries have rectified this, at least partially, there's likely a long way to go before NATO countries fully implement their national defense overhauls that started in the early 2020s. For example, the UK military budget has been hovering around the 2% mark for 2 decades, with a sharp decline from roughly 3.5% at the end of the Cold War. This is further exacerbated by the country slowly losing portions of its armed forces, with the current 184,000 personnel representing a 14% decrease from the 2012 numbers and dropping below 80,000 active troops by the early 20s. Some analysts have gone as far to suggest that the current British Army is woefully unprepared to fight a prolonged, large-scale war similar to the one ongoing in Ukraine. The main proposal to rectify that would be to increase spending far above the minimum recommendation to at least 3% of the country's GDP. This would lead to the UK having a military budget of around $80 billion per year, which will be roughly 1/10 of the US budget, and allow the country to become the world's 4th largest spender overall, behind China and Russia. The budget could be used to improve both the number and combat preparedness of British forces, but also allow the country to modernize its nuclear deterrence systems. France has a different set of issues to contend with. The French government has basically retooled its military into a cooperative force that emphasizes international military operations and joint forces with other NATO members. This has allowed France to develop one of the highest potentials for quick response abroad and rapid tactical response both in Europe and other continents. However, the French military itself has similarly lost manpower in recent years, and the emphasis on international cooperation could mean that the country's focus on its own defenses may have been reduced over recent years. Therefore, it might not be surprising that the UK and France have similar objectives and aspirations inside NATO, mainly reinforcing the cumulative NATO defenses and borders with regard to Russia. After all, both countries have some of the most battle-tested militaries, with practically centuries of military experience in modernization guided by the US. Additionally, both countries have nuclear arsenals and independent nuclear deterrence policies, albeit their sizes and capabilities are dwarfed by Russia and the US. Which brings us back to the ongoing issue of the new Trump administration. Even if Trump acknowledges the progress the alliance has made during the 4 years after his first term, there's no telling whether he would continue to pursue an anti-NATO policy after Inauguration Day. If the US makes a 180-degree turn in NATO-oriented policies and starts looking into leaving the alliance altogether, it would mean NATO could lose the largest economy and military in the world, practically crippling its defensive capabilities. Of course, the European nations combined would still be able to win a potential war with Russia, so long as the latter doesn't resort to nuclear warfare. Perhaps more importantly, Trump's administration could lead to the US pushing for deepening its relations with Russia, just like it did in his first term. This could embolden Putin to make more offensive moves both in Ukraine and elsewhere, and some of those will be out of NATO's purview and control. Both Ukraine and Russia are aware of the fact that the new US presidency could upend the entire tide of war, considering that the US has significant influence in NATO, which is in turn practically the only reason Ukraine has been able to wage war for as long as it has. Russia's increased tempo in Donbass and unveiling of more devastating ballistic weapons shows that it could be mounting a much more extensive offensive to kick off 2025, just in time to start making proposals for a peace treaty under Trump's guidance and oversight. And while analysts have previously suggested that the war was unlikely to finish during 2025, the changing geopolitical stance of the US could turn those estimates on their heads. It's up to the rest of NATO to make more determined and extensive moves to ensure that the US remains aligned with the alliance after the administration change. France and the UK are likely to remain big factors and influencers on those decisions. However, that still leaves us with a few concerns. Neither country is willing to make any immediate decisions regarding Ukraine, especially in terms of direct military involvement. If this continues, NATO could lose the advantage in the pro-defense narrative it's maintained over the past few years. But what do you think? Will the UK and France go against US leadership and try to move NATO deeper into conflict with Russia? Or will the US prevail in its wait-and-see approach? Ukraine has permission to strike Russian targets inside Russian territory, meaning the world may be inching ever closer to World War III. At least, that's the impression that David Cameron, the UK's Foreign Secretary, gave with recent comments that appeared to give the green light to Ukraine. The Kremlin didn't react well. It believes that using Western weapons to strike targets inside Russia is an escalation of the war it started. And with that escalation, potential repercussions that could see Britain, along with several other NATO-aligned countries, dragged directly into the conflict. The question now is simple: what happens next? Will Ukraine actually start striking Russian targets inside Russia itself? Has it started doing so already, and if so, are Russia's claims of an escalation justified? Before we answer those questions, let's examine the comments that have led us to this situation. On May 3, 2024, David Cameron pledged to provide Ukraine with £3 billion of military aid, approximately $3.84 billion, per year, as long as it takes for that aid to help Ukraine win the war against Russia. That alone would have come as a blow to the Kremlin. Not only would Ukraine receive more help from the UK, which hasn't been shy about supporting the country since the beginning of the war, but the comments represent a long-term commitment. That $3.84 billion will come every year, with no political wrangling required to get it approved. But these weren't the comments that so infuriated the Kremlin. In addition to pledging the money, Cameron also said, "Just as Russia is striking inside Ukraine, you can quite understand why Ukraine feels the need to make sure it's defending itself." A somewhat ambiguous statement. Failing to look at the subtext here could even lead somebody to believe that Cameron is simply restating that Ukraine has the right to defend itself on its own territory, but that's not what he's saying. Prior to making this statement, the UK has generally made it clear that any of the weapons it provides should only be used on Ukrainian sovereign territory. That includes the Storm Shadow missile, which can travel for around 248 miles. Ukraine has used that missile to conduct several strikes in Russian-controlled Crimea, which fits the UK's description of sovereign territory. That much was made clear in February 2024, when the country's government released a statement on the 10th anniversary of Crimea's annexation. "We want to be clear that the UK will never recognize Russia's illegal claims to the region or to any Ukrainian territory, and that we will continue to do all we can to stop Putin's war machine and support Ukraine in their fight for as long as it takes." So Ukraine already had the green light to use British missiles in Crimea, but now it appears to have the green light to use them in Russia itself. Pay special attention to the "just as Russia is striking inside Ukraine" portion of Cameron's comments. They suggest that Britain is fine with Ukraine taking an eye for an eye approach with Russia. Just as Russia strikes in Ukraine, so can Ukraine strike in Russia. Cameron even made that aspect clear later when he said that Ukraine absolutely has the right to strike back at Russia. Britain isn't the only country that has permitted Ukraine to use the weapons it supplies on Russian territory. Politico reports that most countries providing aid to Ukraine since the war began have done so under the condition that Ukraine doesn't use any of the weapons they supply to attack Russia itself. That's changing. Both Latvia and Finland, countries that likely see themselves as potential targets for Russia if it succeeds in taking Ukraine, have since made similar comments to Cameron's. Ukraine has the right to use any weapons they supply to defend itself, which includes direct strikes inside Russia. Moscow's response was outraged. Dmitry Peskov, a spokesman for the Kremlin, called Cameron's comments another very dangerous statement, before going on to claim that they represented a direct escalation of the tension around the Ukrainian conflict. Chillingly, he added that such comments could pose a larger threat to European security if they weren't backpedaled. Cameron has taken nothing back. If anything, his comments appear to have emboldened others. On May 24, 2024, NATO's Secretary-General Jens Stoltenberg took part in an interview with The Economist. Stoltenberg, who is coming to the end of his 10-year stint in the role, used the interview to claim that the time has come for Ukraine's allies to consider whether they should lift some of the restrictions they've placed on how Ukraine uses the weapons they supply. Some already have, as we've seen with Britain, Latvia and Finland. However, The Economist believes that Stoltenberg's comments may have been targeted toward the United States. It says his claims had a clear, if unnamed, target, with the US lifting its own restrictions potentially being a key factor in Ukraine's ability to defend itself against Russia. It gets worse for Vladimir Putin. A Sky News report from May 28th looked at the comments made by Poland's foreign minister, Radosław Sikorski, who believes that the country shouldn't rule out sending its troops into Ukraine. Those comments echo French President Emmanuel Macron's words in February. "We shouldn't rule it out. We should leave Putin guessing as to our intentions." Putin is watching his war with Ukraine slowly shift. In the past, he's been able to launch operations in Ukraine with no direct threat being posed to Russia, even though he understood that Ukraine was receiving weapons from overseas and those weapons were being used to kill Russian troops inside Ukraine. He knew that Russia itself was safe. Ukraine could only use those weapons to defend itself on its own territory. Now he's not so certain. He has several countries, France and Poland included, claiming that direct intervention inside Ukraine is a possibility. And with Britain, France and Latvia all approving the use of their weapons in Russia, as well as NATO's Secretary General placing pressure on the United States, it may only be a matter of time before Ukraine starts to target military installations in Russia itself. Putin's response shows just how much these recent developments concern him. Outside of using a Kremlin spokesperson to talk about how Britain's green light represents an unnecessary escalation of tensions within Europe, he has also directly threatened the United Kingdom. On May 6th, Reuters reported that Russia summoned the country's British ambassador, Nigel Casey, to its foreign ministry to lodge a formal complaint against Cameron's comments. For its part, Britain denied that Casey was summoned, instead saying he'd arrived for a diplomatic and pre-arranged meeting in which he would reinforce the UK's support for Ukraine. Russia still decided to use that meeting to make threats. The Foreign Ministry supposedly warned Casey that the use of any British weapons on Russian territory, even by Ukraine, would make Britain a de facto part of the conflict, and with that role comes the possibility that British military facilities, both in Ukraine and elsewhere, could be targeted. In case there was any doubt left, the Foreign Ministry went on to say the ambassador was called upon to reflect on the inevitable catastrophic consequences of such hostile steps by London and immediately refute the belligerent provocative statements of the head of the Foreign Office in the most decisive and unambiguous way. It's unlikely that Russia got what it wanted out of Casey. But it had delivered its message: allow Ukraine to use your weapons in Russia, and Russia will respond. If the threat wasn't clear enough from the Foreign Ministry's statement, it was made crystal clear when Putin ordered his military to hold battlefield nuclear weapons drills. That exercise began on May 21st, with Reuters reporting that Russian vehicles had started to gather in Russia's southern military district for the first phase of the drill. The district lies adjacent to Ukraine, with Russia apparently running exercises for the launch of tactical nuclear warheads. To make its point even clearer, Moscow has also involved Belarus in the drills, which is a Russian ally and a country that shares a border with Ukraine. Russia's foreign ministry even provided details about the drills Moscow ran. It said Russian troops were practicing obtaining what it calls special ammunition, essentially code for nuclear warheads, for Russia's Iskander missiles. They were also practicing equipping potential launch vehicles with those missiles, as well as covertly moving them to designated launch positions, presumably so they could be used to strike Ukraine. Aviation units also took part in the drill, with crews practicing how to fit nuclear warheads to Kinzhal hypersonic missiles before they fly into designated patrol areas. Again, a term that seemed like code for potential launching points. These weren't pre-planned drills. Russia's foreign ministry made that clear when it claimed that they should send a sobering signal to the West, specifically the United Kingdom, as well as what it sees as the puppets that the West controls in Ukraine. It added, "We hope these drills will cool the hotheads in Western capitals, while helping the countries that have provided the green light to Ukraine to realize the potential catastrophic consequences of the strategic risks they're generating." There's the word again, catastrophic. As devastating to Putin as Ukraine getting the okay to use British weapons on Russian soil may be, he's using it as an opportunity to showcase Moscow's power. These drills are a stark reminder to the UK, as well as Ukraine, that Russia has tactical nuclear warheads. They're also a reminder that its troops know how to launch those warheads and that Russia is a far stronger nuclear power than Britain. You could also consider the drills a veiled warning to the United States. Don't bow to NATO pressure, Putin may be telling the US. If you do, we may be forced to turn the Ukraine war into a nuclear conflict that will involve the US if you grant permission to use your weapons on Russian territory. The thing is, you could argue that Ukraine is already using Western weapons to strike Russia on Russian territory. Take Ukraine's attacks on Russian oil refineries as an example. Global Witness points out those attacks started in 2024, essentially allowing Ukraine to create a new front in the war. But it's also here where Ukraine starts to see pushback from its military allies. Though Ukraine considers those refineries to be legitimate military targets, not least because they're believed to supply Russia's military with fuel, the United States has urged Ukraine to halt the attacks. Not because the US is worried about the attacks angering Russia. Rather, the US doesn't want Russian oil refineries going offline to affect global oil prices. Global Witness claims that President Joe Biden is so set on keeping US oil prices stable during the November 2024 election campaign that he wants Ukraine to hold off on these attacks until after that campaign ends. America's Secretary of Defense Lloyd Austin outlined this thought process in April 2024, claiming that any Ukrainian attacks on Russian oil refineries would have a knock-on effect in terms of the global energy situation. His recommendation was that Ukraine focus attacks on tactical and operational targets, with Ukraine likely believing that those refineries fall into both categories, seeing as they're thought to be supplying Russian troops with fuel. Those attacks have also been effective. Ukraine struck two facilities during the first few months of 2024, Lukoil's Volgograd and Norsy factories. The latter is especially important. It provides about 11% of Russia's gasoline requirements, with Ukraine's drone strikes dropping its output by half. Attacks on the Volgograd factory resulted in fires breaking out, allowing Ukraine to claim a small victory against the largest petroleum products creating factory in Russia's southern border region. Worse yet for the US argument, court documents obtained by Global Witness show that both factories have signed contracts to supply the Russian military. Volgograd has a contract with Russia's Ministry of Defense dating back to 2018 to supply Moscow's military with oil products. The Norsy factory has a similar contract, in addition to one signed in 2020 that sees it providing jet fuel to the Federal Security Service. These are far from the only Ukrainian attacks on oil refineries within Russia. It's launched 12 in 2024 alone, flying in the face of America's politicized argument about avoiding such attacks because of their impact on oil prices. Still, the US response showcases how some Western nations have approached the concept of Ukraine attacking Russia on its own soil. Other attacks against Russia using Western weaponry are a little more complicated. For instance, does it count as an attack on Russian soil if Ukraine is attacking targets on the Russian side of the front line it shares with its enemy? Putin may think so. He regards all of Ukraine as Russian territory. Plus, his current desire for a ceasefire is on the condition that Russia essentially claims all of the territory it's captured from Ukraine thus far during the war. Following that logic, Ukraine's May 2024 attack on a Russian base in Luhansk could be considered a strike using Western weapons in Russian territory. The Sun reports that aerial images show Ukraine unleashing MGM-140 ATACMS missiles on Russian troops in a captured region of Luhansk. These missiles are devastating. Capable of reaching a top speed of 2,300 miles per hour, they have a range of around 186 miles and can carry a 500-pound warhead. But most notably, the missile essentially releases small bomblets upon detonating, allowing Ukraine to carpet a large area with explosions rather than unleashing a precise missile strike. Ukraine used that feature to its advantage in the Luhansk strike. Aerial footage analyzed by the Institute for the Study of War seems to show that the strikes targeted a Russian training ground, killing 116 troops. Another strike destroyed a launcher and charger in Russian-controlled territory, which Ukraine attacked with 6 of these missiles. There are also Ukraine's attacks on Sevastopol to consider. One of the most recent, a missile strike that struck 2 Russian landing ships and damaged infrastructure at the port in March 2024, demonstrates the level of attack Ukraine is willing to levy at Sevastopol. And again, we may see a territorial wrinkle at play here. Sevastopol is located in Crimea, which Russia annexed from Ukraine in 2014. To Putin, that means it's Russian territory, and any attack using Western weapons could constitute an attack on Russia itself. But to Ukraine, Sevastopol and the entire Crimea belong to Kyiv, with any attacks launched there simply being attempts to retake territory that it believes rightfully belongs to it. The point here is that it's easy to argue that Ukraine is already striking within Russian territory. That's certainly what it's doing with the oil refineries, though it's not confirmed if it's used Western weapons to make those strikes. It absolutely used American missiles in its attacks in Luhansk, if that strike was conducted on territory that Russia had taken during the war. The same goes for the attacks in Sevastopol. Russia claims ownership of the Crimea region, so Ukraine's strikes against Russia's navy there and in the Black Sea could be considered attacks in Russia. Yet Russia has only now started to warn of catastrophic consequences. Is that a response to the UK and other countries giving their tacit approval for Ukraine to attack Russia more directly? Or are the threats another case of Russian bluster that Putin is unlikely to follow through with? That question remains to be answered in the coming months. What can't be argued is that Russia's outrage at what it deems an escalation of the Ukraine war smacks of hypocrisy. Obviously, Russia started the war, meaning it's directly responsible for the escalation of tensions both with Ukraine and Europe at large. But that's not where the hypocrisy ends. Russia has also been more than willing to use weapons supplied by other countries on Ukrainian territory. Take its receipt of hundreds of Iranian-made drones in mid-2023 as an example. A Reuters report from June of that year says the US believes Russia has deepened its military cooperation with Iran by purchasing several hundred one-way attack drones to use in Ukraine. White House spokesperson John Kirby released a statement claiming that Russia has been using Iranian UAVs to strike Kyiv and terrorize the Ukrainian population. He concluded by pointing out that Russia and Iran's military partnership is deepening. The interesting twist here is that Iran acknowledges that it sent drones to Russia. However, it claims that any drones sent arrived in Moscow before the Ukraine war began. Russia also says that it hasn't used any Iranian drones during the conflict, and yet the US says both are lying. It claims Iranian drones have been flowing into Russia since at least August 2022, and the two countries are cooperating so deeply that Russia is building a special plant in its Alabuga Special Economic Zone to build more of the drones. This is all being done despite Western sanctions that are supposed to prevent Iran from supplying Russia. Russia using Iranian drones throws David Cameron's comments into a new light. Given Britain's close military ties with the United States, as well as the fact that these claims are publicly available, he likely knows that Iran is supplying Russia with weapons. He also knows those weapons are being used in Ukraine. That leads to the obvious argument: what's good for the goose is good for the gander. In other words, if Russia is attacking Ukraine with weapons it has sourced from international partners, there's no reason why Ukraine shouldn't be able to do the same. And Iran isn't the only country that's providing Russia with weapons. In February 2024, Al Jazeera reported that Russia and North Korea appear to have worked out a trade agreement. In return for food, North Korea has sent artillery shells, a staggering 3 million of them since September 2023. The report quotes South Korea's defense minister, Shin Won-sik, who says his country's intelligence teams have tracked the transfer of around 6,700 containers believed to collectively carry either millions of 152mm artillery shells or around 500,000 122mm rounds. Talking to the Yonhap news outlet, he says it could possibly be a mix of the two, and you can say that at least several million shells have been sent. In return, Russia has not only been sending food to North Korea, but has also provided it with raw materials it can use when building other weapons. But just as it did with the reports of buying Iranian drones, Russia denies that it's receiving artillery shells from North Korea. Ukraine disputes that. A May 2024 BBC report suggests that Ukraine's military believes that not only is North Korea supplying Russia with artillery shells, but it's also delivering missiles. And those missiles have been fired in the dozens, injuring more than 70 people and killing at least 24. Russian hypocrisy rears its head again, and the list goes on. In April 2023, Reuters reported on Ukrainian claims that the country's military is increasingly finding Chinese components in weapons Russia is using in the country. Speaking in a video call, Vladislav Vlasiuk, who is an advisor for Ukraine's chief of staff, said, "The trend is now that there are less Western-made components but more, not hard to guess which country, made components. Of course, China." Such components were found in all and aerial drones, apparently used to replace the Swiss-made navigation systems those drones use, as well as in the fire control systems used in Russian tanks. The situation with China is a little different from that with Iran and North Korea. China has consistently denied providing weapons to Russia, a claim that appears to be backed by US Secretary of State Antony Blinken. Speaking to the BBC in April 2024, he said, "What's not happening is the provision of actual arms by China to Russia for use in Ukraine. Instead, China has been much more subtle," Blinken says, by providing critical components Russia can use to build up its war machine. He added that around 90% of the microelectronics Russia imports and likely uses in the war come from China, as do 70% of the machine tools used in its factories, just as Ukraine claimed in 2023. The threat of sanctions placed against China is designed to slow down this trade. But the point, as is the case with Iran and North Korea, remains. Russia is getting help from overseas powers to attack Ukraine. In essence, Russia already appears to be doing precisely what it's telling Ukraine it can't do, using weapons supplied by other countries to attack another country's territory. For Ukraine, this simply means that using its Western-made weapons to strike Russia would be leveling the playing field, all of which brings us to a final question. Now that Ukraine essentially has permission to use British weapons in Russia, will it actually do so? The odds are high that it will. After all, Zelensky has renewed his calls for Ukraine's Western allies to allow the use of their weapons in Russia, most recently during a joint press conference he held with Spanish Prime Minister Pedro Sanchez on May 27th. We need to intensify our joint work with our partners to achieve more. Security and tangible coercion of Russia to peace by all means, he said before adding, even those partners who are afraid to give this or that advice should understand that air defense is defense, not attack. In other words, Ukraine wants to use the F-16s and missiles it's receiving from its Western partners to retaliate against the 3,000 Russian aerial bombs flying into Ukraine from Russian territory. Jens Stoltenberg also renewed his calls for Ukraine's NATO allies to allow the use of their weapons on Russian territory. He reinforced what Zelensky said, pointing out that Russian forces are attacking from their own territory behind the front line. Much of that front line, he says, essentially runs along the border between Ukraine and Russia. If you cannot attack Russian forces on the other side of the front line because they are on the other side of the border, then of course, you really reduce the ability of the Ukrainian forces to defend themselves. That comment may offer some insight into the nature of the strikes Ukraine wants to use on Russia. It's not looking to fire missiles at Moscow. Instead, Ukraine simply wants the opportunity to attack Russian positions supporting troops on the front line, even if those positions are within Russian territory. The UK has granted permission for it to do so. Will the United States follow? You can't use our long-range missiles to attack Russia on its own territory. Time and time again, this is the message that the West has delivered to Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky when he's asked to use British Storm Shadow and American ATACMS missiles against Russia. The refusals were based on a good reason. Striking Russia in its territory has long been considered a red line in the Ukraine war. Doing so with missiles provided by Western countries would be even worse, with Russia possibly taking such strikes as one provocation too far. World War III might be the consequence if Ukraine uses the West's long-range missiles in Russia. Zelensky's arguments to the contrary have fallen on deaf ears for over 2.5 years, but now everything has changed. Ukraine finally has permission to use Western-made long-range missiles in Russia. The move represents a massive turnaround in the way the West has approached Putin's special military operation, and it could mean one of two things. Either Ukraine now has a weapon that could help it win the war, or we're all on the verge of a global conflict that Putin has been threatening since the beginning. In this video, we're going to explore the approval Ukraine has supposedly received from the West, as well as the risks posed by the use of these missiles inside Russia. It all starts with the approval. On September 11, 2024, The Guardian reported on hints that the West was on the verge of lifting its restrictions on long-range missile use in Russia. During a meeting with Zelensky in Kyiv, US Secretary of State Antony Blinken claimed that the US has been willing to adapt its policy when it comes to how Ukraine uses the weapons it provides from day one, and that it would continue to adapt as needed. Further comments from British Foreign Secretary David Lammy seem to suggest that such an adaptation would be discussed in Kyiv. Lammy pointed toward Iran dispatching ballistic missiles to Russia as a significant and dangerous escalation that forced a change in strategic thinking in both the UK and the US. The message appeared to be clear. Russia is intent on using foreign missiles in Ukraine, so perhaps it's about time Ukraine could do the same with Russia. However, the conference between Zelensky and his two compatriots came and went with no formal announcement. From the outside, it still appears that Ukraine doesn't have permission to use British or American long-range missiles in Russia. But reports have started to emerge suggesting otherwise. True, there had been no official announcement, the Kyiv Independent claimed on September 12th. However, that didn't mean anything because the UK had already privately decided to allow Ukraine to use its Storm Shadow missiles for long-range strikes in Russia. The newspaper's reports cited anonymous UK officials who claimed that discussions took place behind the scenes of the September 11th press conference had proven fruitful for Zelensky. In fact, the entire press conference that served as the public face of these discussions wouldn't have taken place at all if not for a change in policy on missile usage. Euromaidan Press published a similar report on September 12th, stating that the joint visit of Blinken and Lamy to Kyiv offered a strong indication of the decision to allow the use of long-range weapons. A later report by The Guardian on September 14th suggested that British Prime Minister Keir Starmer is pressing US President Joe Biden to back his plans to allow Ukraine to use Storm Shadow missiles to strike Russia. Look beyond the diplomatic wrangling and it seems likely that Ukraine had in fact received permission to use Storm Shadow missiles however it sees fit. That permission isn't official. The UK hasn't come out publicly to say that Ukraine can use its missiles inside Russia, but behind the public diplomatic wrangling, discussions have taken place that appear to have resulted in Ukraine being allowed to finally cross one of Putin's biggest red lines. Which brings us to a key question: why do Storm Shadow missiles even matter? After all, Ukraine has received billions of dollars in military aid during Putin's special military operation, which has already included Storm Shadows. It's been using the missiles too, focusing Storm Shadow strikes on Russian military positions in Crimea. If Ukraine already has these missiles, why is it such a big deal that it's being allowed to use them to strike targets inside Russia? To answer that question, we need to understand what a Storm Shadow missile is. The result of a joint effort by the UK and France to develop a new long-range missile, Storm Shadow is a long-range cruise missile that can be launched from ships, submarines, and aerial platforms. Each missile measures 16.7 feet and has a launch weight of 2,866 pounds, 881 pounds of which is a high-explosive warhead capable of penetrating defenses to ensure the missile hits its target. We've seen this in Crimea already. Storm Shadows have been able to break through the roofs and similar defenses of Russian military installations in that annexed region to wreak destruction. The BBC dubs the missile the ideal weapon for penetrating hardened bunkers and ammunition stores, such as those used by Russia in the Ukraine war. The missiles are powered by a turbojet propulsion system, allowing them to reach speeds of over 600 miles per hour. However, it's the missile's range that makes it such a threat to Putin. A Storm Shadow can travel for up to 155 miles, meaning that each $1 million missile is capable of striking targets far beyond the front lines established in the Ukraine war. That's why these missiles matter so much to Ukraine. As the BBC reports, Ukrainian cities on the front lines of the war face constant bombardment from Russian missiles, drones, and glide bombs. The latter is especially devastating. In March 2024 alone, Russia dropped 3,000 glide bombs on Ukraine. These Soviet-era bombs weigh hundreds of pounds and have been equipped with fold-out wings and satellite navigation systems that allow them to glide to a target while evading anti-air defenses that are tuned to take out missiles and drones. Each of these glide kits costs between $20,000 and $30,000, giving Russia a cost-effective way to destroy Ukrainian cities without burning through far more expensive missiles. The key to these glide bombs is that Russia can launch them from behind the front lines. Its planes don't need to cross over into Ukraine, meaning Ukraine is helpless to stop them while operating under the long-range missile restrictions that have been placed on it for most of the war. The BBC even notes several claims that Russia's military air bases were better protected than the average Ukrainian citizen because of these restrictions being in place. With permission to use Storm Shadows, Ukraine can finally hit back against these air bases and quell the flow of glide bombs into the country. The Institute for the Study of War points out that Storm Shadows would allow Ukraine to directly strike up to 200 Russian air bases and ammunition stores, many of which lie within Russian territory behind the border it shares with Ukraine. Several key Russian regions, including Kursk, Belgorod, and Rostov-on-Don, would become targets, with Kursk and Belgorod already being subjected to Ukrainian invasions in recent weeks. With Storm Shadow attacks, Ukraine could take out both ammunition stores and Russian troops arriving to thwart its incursions in these regions, effectively securing a new front line within Russian territory. So we have two reasons why the UK granting permission to use Storm Shadows inside Russia is so important. With these missiles, Ukraine can take out glide bomb stores and the air bases being used to launch these devastating weapons, providing much-needed relief from aerial attacks for its cities on the front lines. Secondly, Storm Shadows could serve as key support weapons for the Ukrainian troops invading Kursk and Belgorod. The missiles could take out key Russian installations and limit Putin's responses to those invasions, giving Ukrainian soldiers on the ground more time to build fortifications and secure the territory they've taken. But there's more. According to ABC News, Ukraine also sees Storm Shadows as a potential catalyst for seizing the initiative from Russia as the war enters a third year. Russia's steady advance into Ukraine is likely to slow down when winter comes. Having long-range airstrike capabilities allows Ukraine to take advantage of that slowdown, as it can use storm shadows to take out supply depots and communication centers with pinpoint strikes, thereby preventing Russia from organizing future assaults in the spring of 2025 and beyond. Those strikes could limit Russian air superiority, particularly when it comes to the previously mentioned glide bombs, and could even open the door for Ukraine to create pockets of air superiority of its own. In that sense, storm shadows could be an ideal support tool for the dozens of F-16 fighter jets set to enter Ukraine in 2025. The missiles could take out Russian air bases near the front lines, leaving the F-16s, or indeed any other fighter jets Ukraine decides to use, free to support troops on the ground as they push Russia back. At the very least, storm shadows could create breaks in Russia's supply lines, damaging its logistical capabilities to the point where its troops aren't receiving the equipment they need. In short, storm shadows give Ukraine breathing room. They present a clear attacking threat to Russia that will force Putin to push some of his most destructive assets further behind the front lines, making them less of a threat to Ukraine in the process. The problem, as well as the reason why Ukraine has been so slow to permit Ukraine to use storm shadows inside Russia, is that Putin has been making threats. Lots of them. The use of long-range missiles in Russia has long been one of Putin's red lines, actions most believe would provoke Russia into becoming more aggressive. He's made repeated claims that he would consider the use of Storm Shadow missiles inside his territory as tantamount to a declaration of war by NATO against his country. Those claims were reiterated on September 12, 2024, when reports of the UK secretly allowing Ukraine to use Storm Shadows emerged. That will mean that NATO countries, the United States, and European countries are fighting Russia, he claimed. Al Jazeera also reported on Putin's claims that permission to use the first missiles would amount to direct involvement of NATO countries, while adding that the Russian leader believes this would change the very nature of the conflict. While the exact nature of this threat is unclear, it appears that Putin was saying that escalation will result from storm shadows being used in Russia, just as he's claimed for every red line that Ukraine has crossed during the special military operation. More threats came from Kremlin spokesman Dmitry Peskov, who said that Russia believes that Starmer and Biden have already struck a deal to permit Ukraine to use long-range missiles in Russia. Peskov's threat was as vague as most that Russia has made during the war, with the spokesman simply saying that the Russian response will be appropriate. It all adds up to a potential flashpoint between Russia and NATO. If Putin is to be believed, any use of Storm Shadow missiles inside Russia would be tantamount to an escalation at best and a full-blown declaration of war at worst. And if Russia's president feels like NATO is starting to truly represent a threat to his position as his country's strongman leader, there's no telling what he might do in response. Make no mistake about it, there are clear and serious risks involved in allowing Ukraine to use Storm Shadow missiles. It would be naive to think otherwise. Counterfire made this clear in an article published on September 17, 2024, just days after the news of UK's supposed approval of Storm Shadow emerged. It mentions that the British government has championed vociferously the use of these missiles, no doubt spurred on by Putin's May 2024 threats of retaliation after the UK allowed Ukraine to use other British weapons inside Russia. That event caused UK Ambassador Nigel Casey to be summoned to the Kremlin, where he was told that British military facilities and equipment in Ukrainian territory and abroad could face the full wrath of Russia's military might if it didn't retract its permission. The UK issued no retraction. Russia hasn't attacked Britain. But the fact that such an unambiguous threat was made against the UK has spurred many in the country into believing that Ukraine needs to be able to use Storm Shadow missiles in Russia to lessen the threat that Putin poses beyond Ukraine. However, the website also points out that not all in the West support the idea. It notes that Starmer and Biden failed to provide explicit permission for Storm Shadow usage during their meeting on September 13th, suggesting hesitancy on at least Washington's end. Germany's Chancellor Olaf Scholz has also shown hesitation, refusing to supply Ukraine with any of his country's Taurus missiles, which are cruise missiles with a range of around 300 miles. Why the hesitation? It doesn't all come down to the threats Putin has made relating to these long-range missiles. Counterfire points out that though Ukraine using Storm Shadow missiles will force Russia to move its military depots and aircraft deeper into Russia, it's unlikely to do much to relieve Russian pressure in the Donbas region. That part of the conflict is primarily fought on the ground, with some air support coming from the previously mentioned glide bombs. Even if those bombs go away, Russia still has the advantage in manpower and ammunition production, with the country producing 3 artillery shells for each one the West produces. Ukraine's priority in Donbas, the outlet argues, is mobilizing enough soldiers to halt the Russian advance, rather than using long-range missiles to strike inside Russia. So a tactical element comes into play. Some Western countries are hesitant to deliver long-range missiles to Ukraine, not because they're especially worried about Russia's response, but because they feel the missiles won't make much of a difference. Remember that each of these missiles can easily cost $1 million or more. The German Taurus costs $1.1 million per unit. Perhaps Scholz believes his country's money is better spent on equipment that Ukraine can put to better use in the Donbass. Still, it's unwise to ignore the risk of escalation. Counterfire points out that some in the West are operating on the logic that Putin is all bluster and no follow-through. His actions up to this point seem to prove their case. Putin's threats of reprisals and nuclear Armageddon have extended to F-16s arriving in Ukraine, Finland and Sweden joining NATO, and even the supply of tanks to Ukraine. All of those things have happened without the Russian president pushing the nuclear button. Providing Storm Shadow missiles to Ukraine would likely merit the same response: no major escalation. The problem with this logic is that Russia has been escalating, Counterfire claims. It's just been doing it slower than the West expected. The escalation has, so far, remained under control, with Russia strengthening its attacks in response to each of its red lines being crossed. In the case of Storm Shadow missiles, their use in Russia may require significant direct logistical support from the West, which Putin and many in the West may view as equivalent to the West actively getting involved in the war. Scholz himself has claimed that British troops have helped Ukraine with target control for the Storm Shadow missiles used in Crimea, with Putin parroting that argument. The British deny it, but the simple fact that there's such confusion over British involvement creates a danger. There are also fears over the targets Ukraine might choose now it has free rein to use Storm Shadow missiles. Military depots and airfields are one thing, but what if Ukraine turns its attention to Russia's nuclear sector, civilian targets? What if Ukraine gets an eye for an eye approach and starts attacking cities directly with Western-made missiles? That would create a diplomatic firestorm that allows Putin to claim that the West is committing war crimes against the Russian people by enabling these attacks. As hypocritical as that would be given Putin's actions in the war, Russia killed or wounded 30,457 civilians during the first 2 years of the conflict, the Russian leader would believe he's justified in escalating further if Ukraine used Storm Shadows on civilian population centers. Of course, much of this is speculative. Ukraine likely won't use Storm Shadows to attack civilians or nuclear infrastructure. Given the clandestine nature of the approval it's received, there may have been specific conditions barring them from doing so. But the mere fact that these concerns exist, coupled with the Kremlin's capacity for spinning almost anything into pro-Russian propaganda, means there are clear risks attached to using these missiles inside Russia. In a September 22, 2024 article, CNN also makes the point that the battlefield dividends of Storm Shadow missiles are less than clear. It points out that US intelligence suggests that around 90% of the Russian aircraft used to launch glide bombs are situated at least 186 miles away from Ukrainian territory, putting them out of the reach of Storm Shadow missiles. The relocation of many of these planes deeper into Russia puts them even further out of reach. That might be the point for Zelensky, who would argue that forcing those Russian installations back makes them less effective and gives his soldiers more time to react to incoming glide bombs. Still, moving these airfields deeper inside Russia also means that Ukraine can't use Storm Shadows to destroy them. CNN also points out that even in the absence of these targets, Ukraine can still hit ammo depots and military headquarters with its Storm Shadow missiles, meaning some battlefield utility exists. George Barros of the Institute for the Study of War also notes that the mere threat of permission being granted means Russian aircraft are being pushed further away from the border. The natural consequence is that those aircraft will run fewer bombing missions, while giving Ukraine extra detection and reaction time to deal with incoming bombs and missiles, just as Zelensky wants. Others argue that Ukraine could use Storm Shadows to take out Russian air defense systems. Matthew Saville, who serves as the Director of Military Sciences at the Royal United Services Institute, says, "If you punch a hole through, actually Ukrainian long-range drones have got better options to penetrate deeper into Russia." This approach would see Storm Shadow missiles play more of a supporting role for Ukraine. They take out the anti-air defenses, clearing the path for the mass drone attacks that have proven so successful for Ukraine so far. More drones means more ground cleared, opening the door for ground troops to establish control in key areas. There's also another possibility. Ukraine being able to use Storm Shadows in Russia could give it leverage in future negotiations. Counterfire makes that point while noting that there's steadily growing support for negotiations within Ukraine following Ukraine's failed counteroffensive of 2023. In July 2024, the Ukrainian think tank Razumkov Center polled 2,027 people on the issue, finding that 44% of the respondents supported opening talks to end the war. A further 21% said they were unsure, with 35% saying now is not the time to negotiate. There is a caveat to these results. Most Ukrainians don't believe those negotiations would create a lasting peace. Over 80% believe that Putin would only accept an end to the conflict on his terms, which would likely mean Russia claiming the territory it currently holds in the Donbass and Mariupol. Those terms are unacceptable to the vast majority of Ukrainians, the poll claims, suggesting Ukrainian people believe that the country is stuck when it comes to negotiating. Ukraine needs more leverage if it's going to get what it wants out of these negotiations. So from Ukraine's perspective, there's little point in even starting talks until that leverage is in place. Ukraine's recent incursions into Kursk and Belgorod could provide some of that leverage, especially now that Ukraine holds over 450 square miles of territory in the former. Perhaps adding the threat of Storm Shadow missiles could provide the leverage Ukraine needs to negotiate for a complete end to the war that sees Russia keep none of the territory that it's taken. Again, it's all speculation. The only thing that seems certain is that the UK has permitted Ukraine to use Storm Shadows in Russia, albeit without making any sort of public announcements relating to that usage. But is that even certain? On September 21, 2024, Le Monde published an article claiming that the supposed permission to use Storm Shadow missiles in Russia hasn't actually been granted. It quotes Zelensky, who told reporters that neither America nor the United Kingdom gave us permission to use these weapons on the territory of Russia on any targets at any distance. He adds that he believes that both are worried about an escalation in the wake of Putin's renewed threats that a war with NATO will result from the use of Storm Shadow. That claim throws a wrench into the works. On the one hand, it seems to support what we're seeing from the public-facing side of this missile controversy. After all, the UK and US haven't given official permission for the use of their long-range missiles in Russia, and that lack of permission likely boils down to what Zelensky claims, fear of Russian reprisal. On the other hand, Zelensky may be simply upholding the ruse. The permission to use Storm Shadow missiles has apparently been granted privately, so Ukraine's leader claiming not to have that permission could be part of the deal. Don't claim to have the go-ahead, but use the missiles as you see fit. If the latter is the case, you'd have to imagine the smokescreen will evaporate the first time Ukraine uses a Storm Shadow to take out a target in Russia. There's one more possible reason why Britain has permitted Ukraine to use Storm Shadow. Ukraine may be using the missiles to buy time. In December 2023, Ukraine's Deputy Defense Minister, Ivan Havryluk, claimed that Ukraine was working on a modification to its self-made Neptune missiles to give them long-range capabilities. Forbes military writer David Axe says that these modifications focus on extending the physical length of the Neptune, creating more space in which Ukraine can add fuel. That extra fuel could give the anti-ship missiles a 250-mile range, roughly equivalent to the Storm Shadow. So perhaps the goal of allowing Ukraine to use Storm Shadows in Russia isn't merely to give Ukraine more offensive capabilities. The UK could be buying time for Ukraine, allowing it to present a long-range threat through Western weapons while it works on developing its own missiles and ensuring it has the infrastructure needed to ramp up production at home. Where does all of this leave the situation between Russia and NATO? It's difficult to say. While various outlets claim Ukraine can use Storm Shadow missiles in Russia, there's no official confirmation from the UK. Without confirmation, it's difficult to predict how far Ukraine will go with the Storm Shadows it has left in stock. Putin is obviously wary. He's reinforced his threats of war between Russia and NATO if those missiles are used to strike targets within Russian territory. But he could also be bluffing. He's made similar threats about other red lines being crossed before, but has not expanded his special military operation outside of Ukraine yet. If nothing else, the permission to use Storm Shadows inside Russia makes Ukraine more of a threat to Putin, which could give Zelensky leverage in future peace talks, while at the same time buying Ukraine time to develop its own missiles. But what do you think about all of this? Has Britain really permitted Ukraine to use Storm Shadow missiles inside Russia? Or does the lack of an official announcement mean Ukraine still faces restrictions on missile usage? How do you think Putin will react if a Storm Shadow is used to destroy a target in Russia? How do you get a tank or armored vehicle into Ukraine? That may seem like a strange question to ask given the massive network of supporters Ukraine has in mid-2024. Dozens of countries are sending financial aid to Ukraine, often in the form of military equipment. The obvious answer would be that the equipment that Ukraine needs is being flown, driven, or even sailed into the country via any number of other supporting nations. But it wasn't always like that. During the early months of the war, Ukraine found itself scrambling to get its hands on any equipment it could find, with tanks and armored vehicles being priorities. It needed both, not only to repel the Russian invaders, but to fight them on a near equal footing as they used their own tanks to take territory. Ukraine didn't have the support of other nations during those early days, but it did have another route it could take to get the tanks it needed: private arms dealers. That brings us to the question we'll answer in this video. how did private arms dealers help Ukraine to fight back during the early days of the war? To begin answering the question, we'll introduce you to UK-based businessman Nick Mead. Aged 61, Mead has always been a military enthusiast, which is likely why he set up his business, Tanks a Lot. The business had a fairly benign purpose. Mead would buy old tanks to give them the once-over before making them available to anybody who wanted them. His customers often included the producers of movies and TV shows, who would rent his tanks for use in their productions before returning them. Mead also made the tanks available for experience days. He would rent them out to venues or host special events at his farm in Northamptonshire. Mead had been running the business for around 2 decades, and he developed quite the reputation. Some even consider him to be the best in the UK, at least those operating in the private sector, when it comes to tank engineering. Then the Ukraine war began, and suddenly Mead saw an entirely new business avenue open up, selling his collection of tanks to Ukrainian buyers. It was all legal. Working alongside the UK's Department of Trade and Industry, Mead began refurbishing and selling his tanks to Ukraine, bullet and bomb-proofing dozens of the vehicles before sending them off to the front lines of the war. It was a profitable venture for Mead, as 2022 saw his business turn over an astonishing £8 million, around $10.2 million, thanks to the sales. All of this raises some interesting questions, not least of which was how was all of this legal? We've established that Mead was able to work within official channels to sell his tanks, but it's the question of how he built up such an impressive collection that will confuse many viewers. First of all, it's legal for anybody to buy a tank in the United Kingdom, as long as they meet a handful of conditions, according to Key Military. The vehicle must be properly licensed with the country's Driver and Vehicle Licensing Agency, or DVLA, just as a regular car would be. The prospective tank owner also needs to prove that they have an H license, or that they're being supervised by somebody with such a license, and will equip the tank with L plates to signify that they're a learner driver before they take it out on the road. An H license covers any vehicle that has tracks instead of tires, which can include bulldozers, snowmobiles, and excavators in addition to tanks. You likely noticed the mention that it's legal for somebody with an H license to drive a tank on the road. That's absolutely the case in the UK, though conditions apply again. For one, the tank must be equipped with special rubber pads or rubber tracks, allowing it to be driven on roads while minimizing the risk that it will cause damage to public highways. There are also conditions placed on the tank's width and weight. It can be no more than 9.5 feet wide, with its weight amounting to no more than 48.5 tons. Then there's the armament issue. Though the UK appears surprisingly liberal when it comes to tank ownership and driving, it has strict rules for firearms ownership. Without a license, you can't own a live-firing gun, with that rule applying just as much to the cannon of a tank as it does to regular small arms. Museums often get exemption to these rules, but a private collector like Mead would likely hone in on tanks that have either been deactivated or have reproduction cannons that can't actually be fired. Many buyers choose to have the Birmingham Proof House conduct an on-site visit to confirm the tank's cannon is neutralized, assuming it doesn't come with certification saying as much. The point here is that it's legal for somebody in the UK to own a tank. In Mead's case, a pathway to selling them to Ukraine was opened up by the country's Department of Trade and Industry. That leads us to another question. Who's buying tanks from private sellers? One of the answers to that question comes from a Channel 4 report published on YouTube in 2023 that took a closer look at Mead and the steps he took to sell his tanks to Ukraine. The report notes that Mead experienced a few instances in which his tanks ended up in the hands of other buyers and resellers, one of whom bought several only to store them on his farm so he could sell them at a later date when Ukraine would be willing to buy them at an even higher price. Mead wasn't comfortable with that, both for the profiteering aspect and because he believed his tanks needed to get to Ukraine as quickly as possible. As he points out in the video, they need it now, not in 3 months. Accordingly, he adjusted his strategy so he would only sell to trusted buyers. One of those buyers is a man named Slav. A Ukrainian national who's lived in the UK for around 20 years, Slav is something of an intermediary between sellers like Mead and the Ukrainians who need access to his tanks. He set up shop on the day that Russia invaded his home country, facilitating the transfer of 2 Land Rover vehicles as soon as he heard about the invasion. In that case, he drove the vehicles to Ukraine himself, showing that there was a clear route through to the country for private sellers. Their vehicles can simply be driven in because practically all of the European countries to the west of Ukraine support it in its war effort. Like Mead, Slav started working through more official channels following that initial transfer of Land Rovers to Ukraine. Specifically, he's become an intermediary for the Ukraine World Congress, which is a non-governmental organization, or NGO, that raises money from ordinary people to fund the purchase and facilitate the arrival of military equipment into Ukraine. That allowed Slav to scale up his production, in addition to giving Mead a buyer who would purchase from him in bulk. The sale of 25 of Mead's armored personnel carriers, or APCs, is a good example. Slav helped them to get from Meade to where they needed to go with the NGO's help. Interestingly, there's even an element of branding in play, making Meade's budding arms business akin to a regular consumer-facing company. In the case of the APCs, each was stamped with a special logo created by Slav to demonstrate where they came from, as well as being given the paperwork they needed to be transported via road across Europe to reach Ukraine. From there, the vehicles Meade sells begin a 2,000-mile journey from his farm to the Ukrainian front lines. Slav is far from the only intermediary of this nature in the UK. According to Channel 4, another is Serhiy Prytula. He runs a charity in the country that buys equipment from private sellers to send over to Ukraine's forces. He's also a former politician and TV star in Ukraine, with the Channel 4 report claiming that he was responsible for mediating the purchase of 100 APCs from 5 different suppliers in the UK in 2023. People like Slav and Serhiy proved vital during the early days of the war in Ukraine, when the country was scrambling to get its hands on any equipment it could to fend off Russia. But even now that billions of dollars of military aid are pouring into Ukraine, these private sellers and their intermediaries aren't going out of business. In fact, Channel 4 notes that Serhiy is still calling for donations and that he has vehicles his charity has purchased waiting to be transported into Ukraine. In other words, selling weapons and military equipment isn't a cottage industry focused solely on Nick Meade. Just as there are several intermediaries and groups facilitating the sale of equipment to Ukraine, so too are there many private citizens and small businesses that are more than happy to sell. In the wake of Meade's success, several other enterprising arms dealers have made a pretty penny from selling to Ukraine. For instance, an August 2023 report published by The Guardian discussed the actions of Freddie Verslice, who's the CEO of a defense company named OIP Land Systems. Verslice claims to have purchased 49 old Leopard 1 tanks that used to belong to Belgium, only to sell them off to an unnamed European country so they could be transported into Ukraine. Verslice was cagey about the details. He wouldn't name the country that was serving as the intermediary in the transaction, nor would he tell The Guardian how much he sold the tanks for. However, the newspaper was able to establish that he paid around €37,000, approximately $40,270 per tank, with another of the paper's sources suggesting that the tanks were purchased from Verslice by a major German defense player. That led to speculation that the buyer was a company named Rheinmetall, a German arms maker, which apparently planned to prepare them for export into Ukraine. Germany's defense ministry declined to comment on the transaction. This wasn't the first time that Verslice found himself embroiled in tank-selling controversy. About 7 months before he finally achieved his sale, he found himself in a publicized battle with Belgium's defense minister, Ludovine de Donda, over his intentions to send his old Leopard tanks to Ukraine. That conflict gave some insight into the prices Verslice may have been asking for his tanks. It's an interesting situation. When various nations came together and pledged to send tanks to Ukraine, Belgium wasn't part of that group, specifically because it had sold the last of its tanks, the 50 Leopards, to Verslice. When the war in Ukraine began, Belgium's government got in touch with Verslice with the apparent intention to buy its old tanks back so it could send them to Ukraine. The problem was that Verslice wanted a far higher price to sell the tanks than the price he'd paid to purchase them. How much higher? De Donda claimed that the tanks sold to Verslice for as little as $10,800 were being offered back to Belgium for a staggering $540,000 each. That was despite those tanks not even being operational, meaning Belgium would have to invest even more money to get them up and running again. For the record, Verslice went public to argue against de Donda's assertions. He claims that he bought the batch of 50 tanks for about $2.17 million, bringing the per-tank price closer in line to the $40,000 mark mentioned by The Guardian, and that the sale price he was quoting in February could be anywhere between a few $100,000 and $1 million. He also disputed de Donda's claims that he'd be selling tanks that don't work. Verslice claims that any price he quoted would include the cost of refitting the tanks to make them operational again. He even gave prices for that. Replacing asbestos in a tank engine, for instance, could cost around $80,000, whereas replacing the system that controls the tank's gunfire would set him back around $380,000. If those figures are accurate, he'd be justified in charging as much as he is to sell those tanks back to Belgium, or indeed, to sell them to an unnamed country so they could be sent to Ukraine, as he has to invest heavily into them. If nothing else, Verslice takes offense at what people are saying about him. Specifically, he doesn't want anybody calling him an arms dealer. He's just a guy who buys old things people don't need so he can fix them up and sell them on. Still, this controversy brings us to another question about people like Verslice and Meade. Are they profiteering from the war in Ukraine? It depends who you ask. Meade argues that his only goal is to make sure that Ukraine has access to the tanks and APCs that it needs, making him altruistic at a time when many nations were hemming and hawing over sending aid to Ukraine. But we also can't ignore that Meade made around $10 million from the sale of 100 tanks, a per-tank revenue of $100,000. Some may argue that the truly altruistic would simply donate the tanks rather than selling them at such a high price. Vasileius seems less interested in painting himself as an altruist, instead digging into specifics about how much it costs him to even get his tanks into a sellable condition. Who could bemoan him for making a small profit after putting in the work that Belgium refused to do? After all, wasn't it Belgium that sold the tanks to him in the first place? Why should it then be able to turn around and criticize him for not selling them back just because the country got rid of the last of its stock before the war in Ukraine erupted? Meade himself has some misgivings over selling his tanks. Speaking in the previously mentioned Channel 4 video, he said that the high demand for his product created soaring prices, noting that there are some who believe he's profiteering from the war. His response: "I guess we are, and that kind of hurts. What I'm trying to do is help Ukraine." Still, he recognizes that some private arms dealers are exploiting the situation to make more money, which leads right back into the profiteering conversation. How extensive is it? The Kyiv Independent offered some insight in a report published in June 2023. Its report notes the terrible situation Kyiv found itself in at the beginning of the war. Desperate for any weapons it could get its hands on, Ukraine found itself buying at almost any cost, which drew an immediate response from European private arms dealers. The price of services went up, with the news outlet reporting that one broker in these deals started asking between 3 and 6 times the market average for their weapons. This display of supply and demand economics created an unexpected issue. When Ukraine's allies finally started to dedicate money to the country's cause, many found themselves having to spend more than they expected to buy arms from these private dealers. The situation between Belgium and Vasileius, discussed earlier, is a perfect example. Belgium found its spending power decreasing due to the higher prices being charged for tanks it had only sold a short time before. This led to it deciding not to buy, assuming it wasn't the unnamed European country that eventually purchased the tanks in August. The knock-on effect here is that the countries supplying Ukraine that aren't pulling directly from their own stocks are having to spend more on weapons than they did in the past. In the end, Ukraine gets less. Then there's the issue of broker commissions. The report cites one instance in which the price of a specific type of ammo rose by around a third in March 2022. That rise came as the supposed result of private sellers setting up a supply chain of intermediaries, with the ammunition traveling through the Netherlands, Estonia, and finally the Czech Republic before it reached Ukraine. The Kyiv International even traced the final link in that chain, naming it as a Czech company called Excalibur International. But here's the most interesting part. The outlet notes that one broker received $2.175 million commission as part of the deal. That commission amounted to about 30% of the total sale price. The implication is clear. The approximate 30% increase in the price of this ammunition wasn't for setting up a supply chain. Almost all of it appears to have been pocketed by a broker commanding a commission that's roughly equal to the price increase, a commission that industry insiders say is abnormally high. The point is that Ukraine's relationship with private arms dealers stretch far further than an enterprising businessman in the UK selling his old tanks. There's an entire industry here, one that's taking advantage of supply and demand economics while limiting the impact that Ukraine's allies can have by charging them much more for the equipment they want to send over than they would have paid for before the war. The Kyiv Independent is far from the only outlet reporting on private sellers, or even private citizens, bolstering their bank accounts thanks to the Ukraine war. In March 2022, about a month after the war started, Open Democracy noted that at least 5 members of the UK's House of Lords made a tidy profit from the war. Each has investments placed in a company called BAE Systems, believed to be at least $14,700 each, with each benefiting from BAE's share price rocketing up by 23% in the 4 weeks after the war began. Those investors were far from the only ones who saw huge profits in a short period due to the war. The same outlet reports that investors in the German company Rheinmetall saw their share prices increase by 60%, whereas those holding shares in Leonardo, an Italian firm, reaped the rewards of a 44% increase. The Ukraine war has proven profitable for many people, it seems, and the further you move up the chain, the stronger those profits become. In June 2022, Sky News reported on the profits some American companies were raking in thanks to the early months of the war. For instance, Washington's promise of 6,500 Javelin anti-tank systems, made by both Lockheed Martin and Raytheon, would set the US back $100,000 per launcher. Even if the launchers came from pre-existing American stock, that would still need to be replenished, meaning the two companies get a bumper $650 million deal out of the promise. And that's before you consider that each missile the launcher uses costs $78,000. The Ukraine war could easily mean $1 billion or more in revenue for those two companies from that single weapon. Raytheon received another boost with America's decision to send 1,400 Stinger missile systems to Ukraine in June 2022. Those came out of the US reserves, with Raytheon receiving a $625 million contract to replenish the depleted stocks in the aftermath. No matter where you look, there's profit to be made. The previously mentioned BAE Systems locked down a contract to replace 400,000 UK rounds sent to Ukraine, as well as replacing the 108 155mm howitzers the US sent and the Milan anti-tank missile systems offered by France. Is it any wonder that defense companies' shares skyrocketed in the early days of the war? Still, perhaps things calmed down a little once the supplies were sent and the war was a year or so deep. Not at all. In September 2023, Declassified UK reported on arms dealers toasting extremely high profits during the Defense and Security Equipment International event. Often touted as the world's largest event for arms dealers, it was filled with defense companies making a lot of money. As Matthew Bragoni, who represented Ensign Bickford Aerospace and Defense at the event, put it, "Everyone's well aware that the US military has been donating a lot of product that was in stock. The result? We're seeing the second-order effect where these purchases, as the US emptied out their inventory, they're rebuying." Perhaps Meade's misgivings about profiteering were right on the money. Though nations are giving weapons to Ukraine, those weapons aren't materializing thanks to acts of charity. Manufacturers are raking in bumper profits as they're asked to develop more, with private sellers like Meade and Verslice able to snatch up a small piece of the pie for themselves merely thanks to the fact that they own stock that's currently in high demand. Let's come back to the man who started the video, Nick Meade. After making $10 million in sales from his tanks, you'd have to assume that he's sitting pretty with his windfall, but that's not the case. Despite Meade claiming that all he wanted to do was help Ukraine in its hour of need, he's experienced some pretty nasty consequences from his newfound career as an arms dealer. The least of these is having his bank account shut down. A customer of the UK's Barclays Bank for over 40 years, Meade could do little more than sit back and watch as the bank shut down his savings, business and online accounts. The situation became so bad for Meade that he was on the verge of declaring bankruptcy as he lost access to his millions. He even considered moving to Singapore. At least there he could open a new account and continue selling his tanks. "I've sent 100 vehicles to Ukraine in the last year, including tanks with guns, but a bank is driving me out of business," Meade claimed in a 2023 article published in Metro. He also decried the slow reactions of the politicians in the UK, saying he couldn't help but laugh when he saw them collectively applaud themselves for sending 14 Challenger tanks when he'd sent over 100 of his own tanks at that point. But it gets worse for Meade. Barclays shutting down his accounts with no explanation was damaging enough, but he believes he's made himself a target for Russia with his actions. "I've been told that I'm on a Russian hit list for the work I'm doing, and I'm prepared to accept the risk to help Ukraine defend itself," he claims before once again decrying the banks for caring more about the risk his business presents to their balance sheets than the risk he's taking on himself. Perhaps there's some validity to saying that no good deed goes unpunished. Thankfully, there are no reports of a Russian hit squad having successfully taken Meade out of the game yet, and he's far from the only private seller who's providing weaponry to Ukraine. He's simply become one of the figureheads. An example that proves that there are many roads to follow when sending weapons to Ukraine and, to the more cynical among you, many ways to turn a profit from the devastation the war has wrought. But what do you think about Meade and his story? Were his intentions as pure as he made them out to be, or was he simply one of the first of many private sellers and companies to take advantage of a lucky windfall that happened to blow in his direction?